They were mothers, daughters, sisters, and wives, ordinary women caught in the storm of history, forced into places that became synonymous with cruelty, fear, and unimaginable suffering. In the shadow of barbed wire, guard towers, and endless roll calls, women in Nazi camps endured a world that stripped away dignity and tested the limits of human endurance. Their stories were not just about survival, but about strength, resistance, compassion, and the quiet acts of defiance that stood against one of history's darkest regimes. From the first female prisoners brought in for their political beliefs, to Jewish women deported in endless transports, to those who served as nurses, guards, or unwilling test subjects in medical experiments, women's experiences in the camps tell a side of the Second World War too often overlooked. This is not only a history of victimhood, but of humanity under siege. Women worked in quarries, factories, and fields until their bodies collapsed, some forced into labor for industries that profited from their suffering. They were separated from families, stripped of their names, and reduced to numbers, yet many clung to their identities through prayer, songs, or whispered stories. Some risked everything to smuggle food to others, to record the truth in secret diaries, or to resist in ways that seemed impossible. For every woman who survived, there were countless others whose voices were silenced, but through testimony we can still hear their cries, their courage, and their resilience. There were also women on the other side of the barbed wire, guards, nurses, and administrators, who enforced the brutal system, embodying a chilling reminder that cruelty knew no gender. The contrast between these roles, between compassion and cruelty, survival and oppression, reveals the full complexity of life inside the camps. This history is raw, painful, and necessary, because only by understanding it can we honor those who lived it. Tonight we uncover their untold stories from Ravensbrück, the largest women's camp, to Auschwitz, Majdanek, and beyond. We'll trace their daily lives, the horrors they faced, the resilience they showed, and the legacies they left behind. This is not an easy journey, but it is one that demands to be remembered, so that their voices are not lost to time. So settle in with us as we tell the entire history of women in Nazi camps. A story of tragedy, endurance, and humanity in the face of unthinkable cruelty. And before we begin, let us know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. We'd love to hear from our global audience as we share this vital history together. The rise of the Third Reich in 1933 reshaped every corner of German life, and for women, the transformation was swift and suffocating. Nazi ideology assigned women a role limited to Kinder, Küche, Kirche, children, kitchen, church. Propaganda hailed motherhood as the highest calling, rewarding women with medals for producing large Aryan families. Female individuality, education, and careers were systematically discouraged, replaced by state-imposed roles. Jewish women, Roma women, and those deemed undesirable were stripped of even these limited protections. Anti-Semitic decrees targeted them first in schools, professions, and public life. Female teachers, lawyers, and doctors lost their positions as the Nazi machine purged society. At the same time, young women were drawn into Nazi organizations like the League of German Girls, where indoctrination replaced education. Gender became a tool of control, binding women to the ideology of the Reich. Shadows of tyranny fell on them before a single camp was built. The Nazis viewed women through a dual lens, valued for reproduction if Aryan and condemned to persecution if deemed racially impure. While Aryan women were coerced into birthing the future of the Reich, Jewish women were increasingly isolated from society. The Nuremberg laws of 1935 banned marriage and sexual relations between Jews and Aryans, stigmatizing Jewish women as dangerous to racial purity. Humiliation became a daily ritual, from being barred from public parks to being spat upon in streets. Political opponents, especially women tied to socialist or communist movements, also found themselves targeted. Their activism made them visible enemies of the regime, and arrests soon followed. The seeds of gendered persecution were planted early, as both ideology and policy shaped the boundaries of survival. In these years, prisons became testing grounds for a system of mass detention. For many women, the road to camps began in the loss of rights. Tyranny crept into homes, workplaces, and schools long before deportation. The Nazi police state expanded rapidly, with women among its earliest victims. As the Gestapo tightened its grip, thousands of women suspected of resistance, sabotage, or dissent were arrested. Female intellectuals, journalists, and teachers who voiced opposition found themselves silenced through imprisonment. Their fates differed from men not in severity, but in added layers of humiliation tied to gender. Interrogations exploited their vulnerability, mixing political punishment with sexual degradation. In cities like Berlin and Hamburg, women disappeared into prisons where overcrowding and abuse foreshadowed the camps. These arrests were the first threads in a web that would soon span all of Europe. The logic of tyranny required not just silencing men, but crushing women who embodied defiance. Nazi rule sought to erase not only the political opposition, but the spirit of female independence. From these dark cells, the blueprint of future oppression was refined. Women learned that under Nazism, their bodies were both battleground and target. The regime's obsession with control extended to women considered socially or biologically undesirable. Roma women deemed racially inferior were subjected to forced sterilizations under eugenics laws passed in 1933. Prostitutes, the disabled, and women labeled as asocial were swept into the machinery of persecution. Even young girls in reform schools were not spared, transferred into detention centers that blurred the line between prison and camp. Nazi ideology demanded the purification of society, and women's bodies became sites of experimentation. By 1937, sterilization clinics across Germany had operated on tens of thousands, leaving permanent scars on survivors. These policies stripped women of agency, transforming private lives into matters of state. Persecution was not random but systematic, calculated to enforce conformity through fear. For those outside the Nazi ideal, life itself became a crime. Tyranny worked quietly at first, then with increasing brutality, the line between discrimination and annihilation narrowed with each decree. Jewish women were among the first to feel the tightening noose of persecution. Boycotts excluded them from shops, dismissals drove them from professions, and curfews restricted their movements. With every step, they were pushed from the fabric of society into isolation. Wearing the yellow star later sealed their visibility, marking them for ridicule and attack. Unlike men, women bore the added burden of protecting children under impossible conditions. Mothers struggled to keep families fed as their husbands were arrested or barred from work. Daughters witnessed their parents' humiliation while enduring their own exclusion from schools. The Reich's war on Jews was waged in kitchens and classrooms long before it reached the camps. In every Jewish household, women became the front line of endurance. Their resistance was not armed but rooted in the will to protect life against a system bent on destruction. Parallel to persecution, Nazi propaganda continued to glorify Aryan womanhood, creating a chilling contrast. Posters displayed blonde mothers surrounded by children, their smiles masking the reality of forced conformity. The Mother's Cross was awarded in bronze, silver, or gold, depending on the number of children produced. Yet behind this image lay strict control, with women monitored by local officials and pressured to conform. Those who deviated from racial ideals, such as women married to Jewish men, were stigmatized as traitors. Female laborers, once encouraged in the 1920s, were now discouraged unless serving the war machine. Universities reduced spaces for women, signaling that education was unnecessary for their natural roles. Even leisure was politicized, with women's organizations designed to indoctrinate rather than empower. The Nazi state crafted an illusion of reverence while enforcing subjugation. This double standard defined women's place under tyranny, exalted in propaganda, oppressed in practice. The seeds of the camp system were already sown in the 1930s. Early detention centers, like Moringen, built specifically for women, served as precursors to later horrors. Women arrested for political dissent, prostitution, or asocial behavior filled its barracks. These camps combined hard labor with ideological re-education, teaching obedience through fear. Conditions were brutal, with overcrowding, beatings, and starvation commonplace. Guards experimented with techniques of control later perfected at Ravensbrück and Auschwitz. For many women, these early camps were both punishment and rehearsal for larger atrocities. The Reich tested how far it could push its vision of domination. The answer, tragically, was limitless. What began as prisons evolved into laboratories of cruelty. Women learned that there was no safety in silence, only the certainty of escalation. By the eve of war, in 1939, the shadows of tyranny had deepened beyond return. Women across Europe, Jewish, Roma, political disabled, or simply defiant, were already ensnared by a system designed to erase them. Nazi ideology had reduced them to roles of obedience or targets for destruction. The machinery of persecution was ready, with laws, prisons, and early camps laying the foundation. For women, survival would demand extraordinary courage in the face of calculated dehumanization. The years to come would test every bond of family, every instinct of motherhood, every act of solidarity. The suffering that awaited them was unimaginable, yet even in the darkest moments, resilience endured. The story of women under Nazi rule began in silence but unfolded in both tragedy and defiance. Their experiences would illuminate the extremes of cruelty and the heights of courage. In their shadows, the outlines of tyranny came into view. The rise of the Nazi regime in 1933 brought not only sweeping political change, but also the first shadow of fear for Germany's women. Among the earliest targets were those accused of political dissent, women who spoke too freely, wrote too boldly, or resisted too openly. Social democrats, communists, and trade union activists found themselves under immediate suspicion. Female teachers who challenged indoctrination, nurses who voiced concerns, and journalists who questioned authority were marked as dangerous. Their arrests were not isolated incidents, but part of a systematic purge of opposition. Many were taken in the dead of night, their families left bewildered and terrified. The spectacle of public detentions created a chilling effect, silencing neighbors who dared not intervene. By targeting women, the regime struck at both political structures and the fabric of family life. These arrests were both punishment and warning. In every case, fear was the intended weapon. At first, many of these women were sent to ordinary prisons, often held alongside common criminals. The cells were crowded, damp, and filled with the constant echo of footsteps on stone floors. Political prisoners, however, were treated with particular contempt by their guards. Interrogations were harsh, designed less to gather information than to break spirits. In Berlin, the infamous women's prison on Barnimstrasse became a holding ground for dissenters. Female inmates endured endless hours of isolation, broken only by shouted orders and the clanging of doors. Yet even here, the seeds of resilience grew, as prisoners whispered encouragement through walls and passed notes hidden in laundry. The regime underestimated the strength of solidarity among women confined together. Still, imprisonment was only the beginning of their ordeal. A darker system was already taking shape beyond the prison gates. The Nazi state quickly recognized that ordinary prisons were insufficient for its ambitions of total control. By mid-1933, the first concentration camps emerged, initially improvised in former factories, warehouses, and military barracks. These camps were not yet the vast complexes that would later define the system, but their purpose was clear. They were instruments of intimidation, designed to crush political opposition and demonstrate absolute authority. Female prisoners, though fewer in number than men, were no less vulnerable to arrest. Those accused of political resistance, religious dissent, or even defying Nazi social codes found themselves swept into this new system. Dachau, the first and most infamous, became the model, though women were initially sent to smaller separate sites. Here, the lines between criminal punishment and political repression blurred into one. A new, terrifying category of captivity was born. The path from arrest to camp was swift, and mercy was rare. For women, deportation to a camp was a rupture not only of freedom, but of identity. Many arrived without trial, their names struck from public records as though they no longer existed. Families received no information, only silence, and in some cases deliberate misinformation. The journey itself was often brutal. Crowded rail cars, no food, little water, and constant harassment from guards. Upon arrival, the shock of the barbed wire, guard towers, and barking dogs made clear that this was no ordinary prison. Women were stripped of possessions, clothing, and dignity, issued only rough uniforms and numbers. Their personal histories, teachers, mothers, artists, nurses, were erased with bureaucratic efficiency. They became bodies to be controlled, rather than citizens with rights. The transformation from individual to prisoner was immediate and total. The deportations were not only physical, but psychological acts of destruction. The conditions inside early women's camps were deliberately harsh to break both body and will. Overcrowding was constant, with dozens packed into wooden barracks designed for half their number. Hygiene was almost non-existent, with a single bucket serving as a toilet for an entire room. Food rations were meager, consisting of watery soup and stale bread barely enough to survive. Forced labor was imposed from the beginning, with women compelled to sew uniforms, clean facilities, or perform back-breaking agricultural tasks. Guards enforced discipline with cruelty, wielding whips and sticks as symbols of absolute power. Punishments were arbitrary, with beatings administered for the smallest infractions, real or imagined. The deliberate stripping of femininity was part of the system, as women were shaved, shouted at, and treated as less than human. Yet even in these conditions, many clung to fragments of resistance, singing songs softly at night, or preserving memories through whispered stories. The regime sought to erase identity, but it could not extinguish spirit entirely. The expansion of camps in the late 1930s marked the transition from isolated prisons to a vast system of detention. New facilities were constructed specifically for women, such as Moringen and later Ravensbrück, which became the largest female-only concentration camp. These places institutionalized what had begun in smaller sites, turning repression into a full-scale apparatus. Women accused of political dissent were joined by others deemed undesirable under Nazi ideology. Jehovah's Witnesses, Roma women, so-called asocials, and eventually Jewish women were swept into the machinery. Each group carried different stigmas, Yet all were subject to the same brutality of confinement. The camps became melting pots of suffering, where survival depended on strength, chance, and solidarity. For many, deportation meant a one-way journey, with no hope of return. By the eve of the war, the system was firmly entrenched, ready to expand with devastating speed. The personal stories of these early prisoners reveal the human face behind the statistics. Women like Lilo Linke, a journalist arrested for her socialist writings, endured relentless interrogations before being transferred to confinement. Teachers who refused to indoctrinate their pupils, or nurses who protected patients considered unworthy of life, found themselves branded as enemies of the state. Mothers were torn from their children, some never to see them again, while daughters were deported for the actions of their fathers. The cruelty lay not only in the physical suffering, but in the deliberate shattering of families and communities. Oral histories later recorded by survivors speak of the unbearable loneliness, the hunger, and the constant fear of never returning home. Yet they also tell of friendships forged in the darkest circumstances, women who shielded each other from the worst. Their strength became a quiet form of defiance. The early arrests were not just about removing dissent, they were about breaking hope. By the time war broke out in 1939, the pattern of arrests and deportations was firmly established. What began as isolated actions against political opponents had evolved into a systematic mechanism of control. Camps that once held hundreds now prepared to hold tens of thousands, fed by the expansion of Nazi power across Europe. Women remained a minority of prisoners, but their experiences reflected the broader trajectory of repression. The transition from prisons to concentration camps marked a decisive escalation, laying the foundation for mass internment on an industrial scale. In this way, the early years were a grim rehearsal for horrors yet to come. The first arrests had tested the machinery of fear, the camps perfected it. The silence that followed each deportation spread terror through entire communities. With every train that left, the message was unmistakable. No one man or woman was beyond the reach of the regime. In the spring of 1939, as war clouds gathered over Europe, the Nazis unveiled a new cornerstone in their system of repression. Just north of Berlin, on the shores of a tranquil lake, construction crews finished erecting Ravensbrück, the first purpose-built concentration camp designed specifically for women. Unlike earlier improvisations in prisons or converted barracks, this was a camp engineered for mass detention from the very beginning. Its creation signaled the regime's recognition that female prisoners were no longer a marginal problem, but a growing population to be controlled. Surrounded by barbed wire and guard towers, the camp's layout was precise, geometric, and deeply dehumanizing. The rows of barracks stretched across the sandy soil, each one a cage for hundreds of women. Nearby stood administration buildings, workshops, and punishment cells. Beyond the walls, local villagers continued their lives, separated by only a fence from the horror unfolding. Ravensbrück was not hidden in a distant wilderness, but integrated into the heart of Nazi Germany. Its presence was both a warning and a tool of domination. The camp's official purpose was to centralize all female prisoners within the Reich. Women once dispersed across prisons like Moringen or Lichtenberg were transferred to Ravensbrück in large transports. This consolidation allowed the SS to standardize control, surveillance, and exploitation. Under the command of Heinrich Himmler's SS apparatus, Ravensbrück became a laboratory of repression, where methods of control were perfected before being exported to other camps. From the outset, its design reflected efficiency in dehumanization. Barracks calculated to pack in bodies, workshops organized for forced labor, punishment blocks engineered for terror. The camp was encircled by electrified fences and patrolled by guard dogs, leaving no illusions of escape. Watchtowers loomed above the camp, their searchlights cutting through the night. Within weeks of opening, thousands of women had already passed through its gates. The system was expanding faster than the world could comprehend. Ravensbrück was the emblem of that expansion. The camp's population reflected the diversity of those deemed enemies by the Nazi state. Political prisoners formed the initial core: communists, social democrats, trade unionists, and outspoken dissidents. By 1940, Jewish women began to arrive in increasing numbers, many arrested simply for their heritage. Roma and Cinti women, targeted as racially undesirable, were deported in entire family groups, their children often arriving alongside them. Jehovah's Witnesses, punished for refusing military service or pledging loyalty to Hitler, were also confined within its walls. Later, women from across occupied Europe, French resistance fighters, Polish educators, Dutch activists, were shipped to Ravensbrück in endless transports. The diversity of languages spoken within the barracks created a cacophony of voices, united only by suffering. Yet amid this diversity, the SS imposed a strict hierarchy of prisoner categories, each marked by colored triangles sewn onto clothing. This system of division sought to sow mistrust and weaken solidarity. Still, bonds of sisterhood often overcame imposed barriers. Life inside Ravensbrück was brutal from the very first day of imprisonment. Women were stripped of belongings, shaved, and issued coarse grey uniforms that erased all individuality. Each was tattooed or registered with a number, reducing identity to digits on a ledger. Overcrowding was constant, with barracks designed for 250, crammed with more than 1,000. Hunger gnawed daily, as rations consisted of thin soup, mouldy bread, and occasional scraps of vegetable peelings. Disease spread rapidly through unsanitary conditions, with lice and fleas infesting straw mattresses. Roll calls lasted for hours, forcing women to stand in rain, snow, or blazing sun until exhaustion overcame many. Beatings were common, delivered by SS guards or female overseers trained in cruelty. Punishments included confinement in standing cells where women could not sit or lie down for days. Ravensbrück was not simply a prison, it was an assault on body, mind, and spirit. Central to the camp's function was forced labor, which consumed every waking hour. Women were assigned to grueling tasks, hauling stones, building roads, sewing uniforms, or manufacturing weapons for German companies. Siemens, among other firms, exploited prisoners by operating factories adjacent to the camp. The work was endless, with little regard for health or survival. Malnourished women collapsed at their machines, only to be beaten back to their stations. Pregnant prisoners were forced to labor until exhaustion broke their bodies. Others were conscripted into camp kitchens, infirmaries, or as servants for SS families living nearby. Each job carried its own dangers, from exposure to toxic chemicals to back-breaking physical strain. Those deemed unfit for work were swiftly removed, their fate sealed by transports to death camps. At Ravensbrück, survival depended on the ability to endure relentless exploitation. Labor was weaponized as a form of destruction. The SS deliberately fostered an atmosphere of fear and division within the camp. Female guards, many recruited from ordinary German families, enforced discipline with vicious zeal. Armed with whips, sticks, and dogs, they embodied the regime's attempt to strip compassion from authority. Prisoners were sorted into categories by colored patches: red for politicals, yellow for Jews, purple for Jehovah's Witnesses, black for so-called asocials. This system allowed guards to play groups against one another, punishing some more severely to intimidate others. Women who attempted solidarity were beaten or sent to solitary confinement. Informers were planted among prisoners, spreading suspicion and fear. Yet despite these efforts, acts of quiet resistance persisted, sharing scraps of food, teaching children in whispers, smuggling notes of hope. The camp was a crucible of cruelty, but also of resilience. Even in darkness, the human spirit struggled to survive. As the war escalated, Ravensbrück's population swelled beyond its original design. By 1942, tens of thousands of women from across occupied Europe filled the camp's barracks. Transports arrived almost daily, bringing prisoners from France, Poland, the Soviet Union, and beyond. Many were members of underground resistance movements, arrested for sabotage, espionage, or aiding Jews. The influx strained already meager resources, worsening hunger and disease. Deaths became a daily occurrence, their bodies cremated in ovens built within the camp. By the end of the war, more than 130,000 women had passed through Ravensbrück, with an estimated 30,000 to 40,000 perishing inside. Each death was a number on a ledger, but behind each number was a story of a woman torn from her family. The sheer scale of suffering made Ravensbrück not only the largest women's camp, but one of the most tragic monuments of the Nazi system. Its name became synonymous with both horror and endurance. Today, Ravensbrück endures in memory as a symbol of both cruelty and resilience. The barbed wire, the watchtowers, and the crumbling barracks stand as silent witnesses to what unfolded there. Survivors' testimonies have preserved the voices of women who refused to let history forget them. Their accounts reveal both unimaginable suffering and extraordinary courage in the face of despair. Historians view Ravensbrück as a microcosm of the Nazi concentration camp system, tailored specifically to crush women. Yet it also highlights the strength of solidarity, as women of different nations and backgrounds supported one another against impossible odds. The camp's ruins are now a memorial, where visitors confront the weight of history etched into every stone. Ravensbrück represents not only the depths of human cruelty, but also the endurance of human dignity. It is a story that demands remembrance, not only as history, but as warning. The women of Ravensbrück remain voices that still speak across the decades. Each day in the women's camps began not with light or hope, but with the sound of boots striking gravel. At dawn, prisoners were torn from restless sleep by guards barking orders in harsh, clipped German. They stumbled from overcrowded barracks, shivering in thin uniforms ill-suited for the season. The air was often damp with fog or thick with snow, yet women stood barefoot or in wooden clogs on the frozen ground. Roll calls or appel stretched for hours, forcing prisoners to stand motionless in rigid lines. Guards stalked the rows, striking those who faltered or collapsed. The sick, the weak, and the elderly were forced to stand alongside the young and strong. No exceptions granted. Women counted and recounted, as mistakes meant the roll would begin again. Corpses of those who had died during the night were dragged to the line to be included in the tally. The day's brutality began before the sun had fully risen. After roll call came the meager rations that sustained life at its barest minimum. A scrap of stale bread, a watery ladle of cabbage soup, or a thin slice of turnip formed the day's meals. Hunger became a constant companion, gnawing at bodies already weakened by disease and exhaustion. Malnutrition hollowed cheeks, thinned hair, and left women vulnerable to typhus, dysentery, and tuberculosis. Those who managed to secure an extra crumb, a stolen potato, or a sip of milk from a guard's kitchen clung to it as treasure. Fights sometimes broke out over a crust of bread, though many prisoners chose instead to share morsels with comrades. In these small acts of solidarity, humanity flickered against the darkness of deprivation. Yet the system's cruelty was deliberate, designed to strip flesh from bone and will from spirit. Women starved not by accident, but by policy. Hunger was as much a weapon as the whip or the bullet. Overcrowding added another layer of torment to camp life. Barracks designed for a few hundred were packed with over 1,000 women, bodies pressed together on straw pallets. The air was thick with the stench of sweat, urine, and illness, never dispersed by fresh air or light. Wooden bunks were infested with lice and fleas, tormenting prisoners through sleepless nights. Privacy ceased to exist, with dozens sharing a single bucket for sanitation. Disease spread like wildfire in these conditions, with epidemics claiming lives before any treatment could arrive. Quarantine was rarely enforced, as guards saw sickness not as tragedy, but as convenient reduction of numbers. Women coughed, wheezed, and bled alongside one another, clinging to life in spaces unfit for animals. Overcrowding ensured constant exhaustion, as there was no place to stretch, rest, or even breathe freely. The barracks themselves became weapons of destruction, suffocating the will to live. Dehumanization was woven into every detail of daily routine. Prisoners were stripped of their names, addressed only by numbers or insults barked by guards. Uniforms were identical, ill-fitting grey dresses with coloured triangles sewn to the chest, marking categories of supposed guilt. Hair was often shaved upon entry, erasing individuality and imposing humiliation. Guards barked orders without explanation, forcing women to run, kneel, or perform pointless drills in mud. Beatings were frequent, carried out with sticks, whips, or fists for the smallest perceived infractions. Public punishments humiliated victims before their peers, reinforcing the message that resistance was futile. Women were sometimes forced to perform degrading labor, such as cleaning latrines with bare hands. Every detail of life was designed to communicate one message: you are not a person, you are property. The system thrived not only on violence, but on humiliation. Forced labor consumed the bulk of each day, pushing women to the brink of collapse. Work assignments ranged from hauling heavy stones for camp construction to endless hours at sewing machines producing uniforms. In camps like Ravensbrück, many were sent to Siemens factories, assembling electrical components under grueling conditions. Others worked outdoors in freezing cold or blistering heat, digging trenches and hauling logs. Productivity was demanded without tools, without nourishment, without rest. Women who slowed down were beaten, while those who collapsed risked being trampled or shot. Pregnant women and the elderly were given no reprieve, their suffering compounded by merciless supervisors. Evenings brought no relief, as the exhaustion of the day gave way to yet another roll call. Labor was not simply exploitation, it was extermination by other means. The work itself became a sentence of slow death. Amid this brutality, women fought daily battles for survival through ingenuity and solidarity. Some learned to hide scraps of food in hems or under floorboards, smuggling sustenance to the weakest. Others whispered lessons in their native languages, teaching children or illiterate comrades in stolen moments. Skilled seamstresses repaired clothing in exchange for bread, while nurses improvised remedies from weeds or scraps of cloth. Faith played a role for many, with prayers muttered at night or hymns sung softly under blankets. Resistance also took symbolic forms, smuggling notes to the outside, sabotaging tools, or refusing to betray fellow prisoners. These acts were small, yet they defied the system's goal of total dehumanization. To preserve dignity became an act of rebellion in itself. Survival was not only about enduring hunger or disease, but about keeping one's humanity intact. Against calculated cruelty, even kindness became defiance. Yet the psychological toll was relentless, wearing down even the strongest. The constant presence of death, bodies carried away daily, empty bunks left behind, created a climate of despair. Guards reminded women constantly of their expendability, that their lives could end with a command. Mothers feared not only for themselves, but for children deported alongside them, often separated and never seen again. Loneliness gnawed at prisoners from occupied countries, unable to speak the languages of their barracks mates. Letters from home, if received, were censored to the point of emptiness, providing no comfort. Nights were filled with weeping, muffled cries, and the nightmares of those who had seen too much. Hope was fragile, sustained by rumors of Allied advances or whispered news smuggled in by new arrivals. The camps thrived on eroding the mind as much as the body. For many, the hardest battle was fought within the soul. The war for survival was psychological as much as physical. Daily life in the camps was thus a routine of suffering, engineered with precision. Roll calls, rations, barracks, and labor were not mere logistics. They were instruments of oppression. Each hour was designed to grind down the human spirit, reducing women to silence and submission. Yet within this machine of cruelty, humanity endured in fragments, a shared crust of bread, a whispered lullaby, a hand clasped in solidarity. These fragments mattered, for they preserved identity in a world that denied it. Women carried each other through despair, proving that compassion could survive even in the heart of brutality. Their daily struggle testified to both the cruelty of the system and the resilience of its victims. The camps were meant to erase, yet they could not fully succeed. Memory survived, carried in the hearts of those who lived through it, and in their survival, the truth of daily life in the camps endures for the world to witness. The moment of arrival at the camps was often the moment of separation, a scene of confusion engineered to sow despair. Families were herded from train cars, disoriented after days without food, water, or light. Mothers clutched children tightly, desperate to keep them close in the crush of bodies. Guards shouted orders in German. Dogs barked, and prisoners were forced into chaotic lines. In this turmoil, families were divided, men sent one way, women another, children sometimes ripped away without explanation. The brutality of separation was deliberate, tearing apart the most primal human bond in an instant. Pregnant women were marked as unfit for labor, placed aside under the gaze of SS doctors. Daughters old enough to walk were often separated from mothers, shuffled into groups as though they were livestock. The uncertainty of that moment etched itself permanently into the memories of survivors. For countless families, the ramp was their final moment together. Pregnant women faced some of the most harrowing fates in the camps. Upon arrival, they were frequently subjected to immediate selection, branded as useless to the regime's demand for labor. Some were sent directly to death, others forced into labor until their bodies could no longer endure. A few were coerced into abortions under horrific conditions, carried out by untrained inmates or brutal camp doctors. In cases where pregnancies came to term, newborns were often taken from mothers within hours. Infants were denied food or medical care, left to die in barracks or disposed of as burdens. The cruelty of these policies was not accidental, but systemic, rooted in the Nazi belief that certain lives were unworthy of survival. Mothers who tried to shield their infants were punished with savage beatings, sometimes in front of their fellow prisoners. The cries of newborns silenced too soon haunted women long after liberation. Pregnancy in the camps was not a gift of life, it was a sentence of death. Children who survived arrival faced fate scarcely less cruel than their mothers. Those deemed too young to work were considered expendable, marked by guards as mouths without purpose. Many were dispatched quickly, sent away in transports that vanished into the machinery of death. Older children, particularly teenagers, were sometimes spared for labor, thrown into the same grueling routines as adults. Girls were assigned to menial or dangerous tasks, their childhoods erased overnight. They endured the same rations, the same barracks, the same endless roll calls under brutal conditions. Siblings who managed to stay together clung desperately to one another, often acting as surrogate parents. Yet even in these rare cases, separation could come at any moment, whether through death, reassignment, or punishment. In the camps, childhood itself was extinguished, stolen by hunger, disease, and relentless fear. The fate of children became one of the starkest indictments of the system's inhumanity. For mothers, the anguish of separation was a wound deeper than hunger or beatings. The uncertainty of not knowing what had become of their children gnawed endlessly at the soul. Some whispered lullabies into the night air, as if their voices might reach the children taken from them. Others carved memories into scraps of wood or cloth, holding on to fragments of identity in defiance of erasure. Bonds of motherhood were not easily severed, even under the weight of terror. Women in barracks often formed surrogate families, comforting one another with stories of children left behind. Letters, if they ever arrived, were censored to a few bland lines, offering no real news of loved ones. Rumors swirled constantly, feeding both hope and despair. The cruelty lay not only in physical separation, but in psychological torment. Mothers were condemned to live with questions that would never be answered. The psychological trauma of these separations left scars that endured far beyond liberation. Survivors described an emptiness that no food, no rest, no freedom could ever fill. The moment of being torn from a child replayed endlessly in memory, a wound that never healed. Some women carried guilt for surviving when their children did not, unable to reconcile endurance with loss. Others struggled to rebuild families after the war, haunted by the knowledge that their lineage had been severed. Generations later, descendants of survivors still felt the echoes of these ruptures. The silence surrounding missing names on family trees spoke louder than words. In many cases, mothers who lost children refused to speak of them, sealing grief behind impenetrable walls of silence. Trauma became both an individual and collective inheritance. The camps destroyed not only lives, but legacies. Yet even in the face of unimaginable cruelty, moments of defiance and maternal love persisted. Women shielded their children in lines, whispering instructions to stay quiet, to stay close, to stay alive. Mothers shared their rations with little ones, starving themselves so their children might endure a little longer. Prisoners hid infants in barracks, risking their own lives to conceal them from guards. In Ravensbrück, testimonies recall women creating makeshift cradles from rags and wood, singing softly to calm terrified babies. These small acts did not always change outcomes, but they affirmed humanity against a system bent on destruction. The power of maternal instinct became an unbreakable force, even within barbed wire. Stories of women who sacrificed everything for their children became a legacy of courage. Such moments did not undo the horror, but they illuminated resistance in its purest form. Against impossible odds, love endured. That endurance remains a testament to the strength of the human spirit. The trauma of separation reverberated across entire communities, both inside and outside the camps. Families left behind in occupied towns often never learned what became of their mothers, daughters, or sisters. Rumors of deportation circulated, but few grasped the full reality until much later. The silence of absence echoed in households, creating wounds as deep as those within the barbed wire. Survivors returning after the war often found themselves the only members of their families left alive. Reunions, when they occurred, were bittersweet, marked by both joy and unbearable grief. The act of rebuilding family life became a struggle, as survivors carried both memories and scars. Communities fractured under the weight of loss, unable to restore what had been destroyed. The camps had targeted individuals, but in truth they had broken entire family structures. The consequences stretched far beyond the gates of Ravensbrück and Auschwitz. The story of mothers, daughters, and families torn apart remains one of the most searing legacies of the camps. It reminds us that the machinery of repression was aimed not only at bodies, but at the deepest human bonds. Separation was not incidental, but intentional, wielded as a tool of control and annihilation. In the faces of women and children, the regime saw vulnerability, and in that vulnerability it sought dominance. Yet even in the ashes of loss, memory preserves the truth of what was endured. Survivors carried those stories into the post-war world, determined that their voices not be silenced. Today, their testimonies stand as both history and warning, etched into archives and memorials across Europe. They remind us that war destroys families as much as armies, that cruelty seeks to break bonds as much as bodies. Ravensbrück and the other camps remain monuments not only to suffering, but to love that refused to die. In the silence left behind, the voices of mothers and daughters still call to us across time. The arrival at Auschwitz was a descent into a world of terror, designed with chilling precision. Trains screeched to a halt at the infamous ramp of Auschwitz-Birkenau, carrying thousands of women and children packed into cattle cars. The stench of human suffering filled the air, mingling with smoke from distant chimneys that already told the fate awaiting many. SS guards, aided by snarling dogs, forced terrified passengers into lines under floodlights. Mothers clutched children, whispering reassurances they did not believe, while daughters clung to fathers they would never see again. The process was swift. Men separated from women, children separated from parents, each group herded under shouted orders. A doctor in uniform, often Joseph Mengele himself, pointed left or right with the flick of a hand. To one side, labor; to the other, death. For many women, the selection lasted less than a minute, yet it determined the rest of their existence. The cruelty lay not only in the decision, but in its mechanical efficiency. For those selected to live, the process of dehumanization began immediately. Women were stripped of clothing, their hair shorn in crude handfuls by fellow prisoners forced into service. Naked, they were driven into showers, some with water, others merely to humiliate. Guards hurled insults, laughing as dignity was shredded along with clothing. Each woman received a striped uniform, often torn, blood-stained, or infested with lice from previous wearers. Identity was replaced by numbers tattooed onto forearms, a practice unique to Auschwitz. The sting of the needle was less painful than the realization that one's name no longer mattered. The new tattoo was a permanent scar, a reminder of being reduced to a number in a vast system of death. Some covered their arms instinctively, as if trying to shield the last remnant of identity. From that moment onward, individuality had no place in Auschwitz. The women's barracks in Birkenau were bleak monuments to calculated suffering. Wooden huts, originally designed as stables for horses, now crammed hundreds of women into single blocks. Bunks stacked 3 levels high were filled far beyond capacity, forcing women to sleep sideways, shoulder to shoulder. The stench of human waste and rotting straw filled the air, never cleared by ventilation. Rats and lice spread uncontrollably, carrying typhus that killed thousands. Buckets served as toilets, overflowing during long nights when prisoners were forbidden to leave barracks. Roll calls dragged women into freezing dawns, forcing them to stand for hours in mud, snow, or rain. Collapse often meant death, as guards beat or shot those who faltered. Inside the huts, despair hung heavy, punctuated only by coughs, sobs, or whispered prayers. The barracks were not shelter. They were instruments of slow annihilation. Amid this degradation, women endured brutal work assignments meant to exploit every ounce of strength. Many were driven to labor in construction, hauling bricks, digging ditches, or dragging carts like beasts of burden. Others were forced into agriculture, cultivating fields that fed the German war machine, but never their own hunger. In the vast IG Farben industrial complex nearby, women worked endless shifts producing synthetic rubber and fuel. Their exhaustion served both Nazi goals, economic exploitation and physical destruction. Some prisoners collapsed at machines, only to be replaced by others without pause. Pregnant women and the elderly were shown no mercy, their weakness punished with brutality. Even skilled women, nurses, teachers, musicians, were assigned meaningless or degrading tasks. Labor in Auschwitz was never about productivity alone. It was about crushing will and body. Work was not a path to survival, but a carefully crafted tool of extermination. In the midst of this hell, one of the most haunting chapters of Auschwitz unfolded, the story of the women's orchestra, formed in 1943. The orchestra was made up of prisoners with musical training, compelled to perform under SS command. Led by Alma Rose, niece of the composer Gustav Mahler, the ensemble included violinists, cellists, flutists, and singers. They were forced to play marches as work details left and returned, their music echoing against the camp's fences. For some, being in the orchestra meant a chance of survival, spared from harsher labor and granted marginally better conditions. Yet it came at an unbearable cost, as their music accompanied fellow prisoners marching to death or exhaustion. Survivors described the agony of playing cheerful tunes while watching lines of skeletal women pass by. The orchestra's performances became twisted symbols of life and death intertwined. Music, once a source of joy, became a weapon of cruelty in the hands of the SS. The orchestra of Auschwitz remains one of history's darkest paradoxes. Women in Auschwitz endured not only hunger and labor, but also medical experiments. Under the guise of science, SS doctors subjected women to sterilization trials, infectious disease experiments, and bone transplants. Young women were injected with caustic chemicals to render them infertile, many left with searing pain and permanent injuries. Others were deliberately infected with typhus, malaria, or gangrene to test treatments. Twins, including girls, were singled out for Mengel's macabre studies, their bodies treated as specimens rather than human beings. Many women did not survive these so-called experiments, their corpses dissected for further study. Survivors carried lifelong scars, both physical and psychological, from these violations. The experiments revealed the depths of cruelty masked by the language of science. For female prisoners, even the infirmary was not a place of healing, but another site of terror. In Auschwitz, the body itself was reduced to a laboratory for brutality. The psychological torment of Auschwitz was unrelenting, designed to erode even the strongest spirit. The constant sight of chimneys belching smoke reminded women daily of the fate that awaited so many. The cries of children taken to the gas chambers echoed in memory long after the sound ceased. Hope became dangerous yet necessary. As rumors of Allied advances drifted in with new arrivals, some women clung to faith, whispering prayers under their breath at roll call. Others found strength in solidarity, sharing crumbs of bread, tending wounds, or shielding weaker comrades. Bonds formed in barracks became lifelines, sustaining courage in an otherwise hopeless environment. Yet despair was never far, as betrayals for survival also tore at fragile trust. Each day was a balance between despair and resilience, between surrender and defiance. Auschwitz was as much a battle of the mind as of the body. By the time Auschwitz was liberated in January 1945, tens of thousands of women had perished within its fences. Their lives were extinguished by starvation, disease, forced labor, and systematic murder in gas chambers. Yet their voices endure through testimonies, diaries, and memories preserved by survivors. The women's orchestra, the barracks, the tattooed arms, all have become haunting symbols of humanity, crushed yet unbroken. Auschwitz stands not merely as a site of death, but as a testament to survival against impossible odds. Women who endured carried scars for life, but also bore witness so the world could not forget. Their resilience, though forged in suffering, illuminates the darkness of history. The camp's memory warns us of the dangers of indifference, of systems that strip away humanity piece by piece. In the story of women at Auschwitz, we see both the depths of cruelty and the heights of endurance. Their legacy endures as a solemn reminder for all generations. In the hidden shadows of the camps, beyond barbed wire and barracks, lay another form of cruelty seldom spoken of at the time. Sexual violence against women prisoners was not incidental but systematic, embedded within the machinery of oppression. SS guards wielded absolute power over bodies already stripped of identity, exploiting vulnerability with calculated brutality. Rape occurred in barracks during labor or in interrogation rooms cloaked under silence and fear. Women, already starved and broken, were forced into situations where refusal meant death. Pregnancies followed, and in many cases they ended in forced abortions or infanticide ordered by camp authorities. This violence was not only physical, it was psychological warfare, a means of further degradation. Survivors carried shame imposed by their oppressors, compounded by silence from those around them. In an environment engineered to strip away humanity, sexual exploitation was the ultimate violation. It was an atrocity too painful for many to ever put into words. The Nazis institutionalized this exploitation through the creation of camp brothels, known as Lagerbordell, established under Himmler's orders beginning in 1942. These brothels operated in major camps like Buchenwald, Sachsenhausen, Mauthausen, and even Ravensbrück. Women prisoners were selected, often against their will, to serve as forced sex workers for male inmates, and sometimes SS officers. Officially, the program was framed as a reward system to increase productivity among male prisoners. In reality, it was another layer of exploitation, built on coercion and violence. Women chosen for brothels endured daily assaults, with no possibility of refusal. The environment was tightly controlled, with schedules, registers, and SS oversight, reducing human beings to instruments of control. Many of these women never survived long, their health destroyed by abuse, disease, and despair. Unlike other atrocities, the brothels were hidden in plain sight, shielded from outside knowledge. Their existence reveals the regime's willingness to exploit even the most intimate aspects of life. The selection process for brothels was itself a trauma of dehumanization. Women were lined up, examined, and chosen based on appearance, youth, or perceived health. Consent was irrelevant, refusal was met with beatings or immediate death. Some women volunteered under false promises of better food, clothing, or survival, only to discover the horror awaiting them. The SS justified these selections as pragmatic, but they were acts of violence dressed in administrative language. Inmates forced into this system were isolated from other prisoners, stigmatized as collaborators despite their lack of choice. Many were subjected to venereal diseases, untreated and devastating in their effects. The constant cycle of abuse left psychological scars that no liberation could erase. Each woman forced into this role carried a burden far beyond the camp's barbed wire. Their stories are some of the least told, silenced by shame long after the war ended. Sexual violence extended beyond the brothels, infiltrating every corner of camp life. SS guards routinely abused their unchecked power, preying on vulnerable women during night patrols or forced labor shifts. Interrogation chambers doubled as sites of assault, where humiliation accompanied physical violence. Pregnancies resulting from rape were rarely tolerated, with women often subjected to forced abortions in unsanitary conditions. In some camps, newborns were killed immediately, erased from records as though they had never existed. Women lived in constant fear of being singled out, their survival bound to the whims of men in uniform. Silence became a shield, though it offered no true protection. The brutality was not only physical, but symbolic, a deliberate effort to strip dignity from those already robbed of freedom. Sexual violence became another weapon in the arsenal of domination. It was cruelty that cut deeper than hunger or cold. Even within this environment of despair, bonds of solidarity emerged among women determined to protect one another. Prisoners often shielded younger girls from guards, hiding them in crowded bunks or sending them on errands during inspections. Older inmates would volunteer for duties near kitchens or workshops, placing themselves between predators and the vulnerable. Small networks of resistance developed, where women warned each other of predatory guards or passed coded signals to avoid danger. Acts of care extended even to sharing scarce hygiene materials, an effort to reduce visibility to the eyes of abusers. These efforts were fraught with risk, as guards punished women collectively for even the smallest act of defiance. Yet the willingness to protect one another revealed an unbreakable resilience. In the face of systemic exploitation, solidarity became an act of rebellion. It reminded victims that they were not entirely alone. Even in darkness, humanity persisted. After liberation, survivors of sexual violence carried burdens compounded by silence and stigma. Post-war societies, struggling to comprehend the scale of genocide, often overlooked or ignored testimonies about sexual abuse. Women who attempted to share their experiences were frequently met with disbelief, judgment, or shame. Many chose to remain silent, burying trauma in order to rebuild shattered lives. In some communities, women forced into brothels were labeled as collaborators rather than victims. The lack of recognition deepened the wounds, making recovery all the more difficult. Only decades later did scholars and historians begin to give serious attention to this hidden chapter of camp life. Testimonies slowly emerged, often late in survivors' lives, when the fear of stigma had eased. These accounts revealed the depth of suffering endured, adding critical layers to the historical record. Silence itself became part of the legacy of exploitation. The recognition of sexual violence in camps challenges our understanding of survival and victimhood. Unlike executions or forced labor, these crimes left scars that were invisible yet enduring. Survivors struggled with identity, often questioning whether they were victims or unwilling participants. This ambiguity was a cruel aftershock of the Nazi system, designed to fracture lives even beyond liberation. Historical accounts now acknowledge that sexual violence was not rare, but widespread and systematic. It cut across nationalities, religions, and social classes, leaving no group untouched. For women, survival often meant enduring in silence, carrying pain that could never be fully spoken. For historians, acknowledging this truth is a duty owed to those silenced by stigma. Every story adds weight to the record of crimes committed. Without them, history remains incomplete. Today, memorials and scholarship increasingly include the voices of women who endured sexual exploitation. Museums, archives, and oral histories now preserve testimonies once too painful to share. Their inclusion restores dignity, acknowledging truths long buried beneath silence. The brothels, the assaults, the coercion, these were not side notes, but central to the experience of many prisoners. In remembering these stories, we confront not only the crimes of the past, but also the dangers of forgetting. Survivors remind us that silence enables repetition, while truth resists it. The memory of sexual violence in the camps now stands as both warning and witness. It forces us to see history in its full, harrowing detail. The women who endured left us not only with their scars, but with their voices. In listening, we honor their resilience and ensure their suffering is not erased. Among the darkest chapters of the camps were the medical experiments inflicted on women under the guise of science. In places like Ravensbrück and Auschwitz, laboratories of cruelty emerged within barbed wire enclosures. SS doctors, supported by the authority of Heinrich Himmler and the Reich's obsession with racial engineering, turned living bodies into test subjects. For women, this meant their suffering was not only endured in labor and starvation, but also in operating rooms without anesthesia. Scalpel blades cut into flesh, not for healing, but for data to feed ideology. These experiments combined pseudoscience with sadism, dressed in the language of progress. Doctors wore white coats, the trappings of medicine concealing their role as agents of torture. Women lay strapped to tables, unable to resist, their cries ignored or mocked. The line between healer and executioner was obliterated. The camps became laboratories where humanity was dissected without mercy. One of the most notorious programs was forced sterilization, targeting women deemed undesirable by Nazi racial policy. Using caustic chemicals, high-dose X-rays, or crude surgeries, doctors sought ways to render women infertile efficiently and cheaply. Prisoners, often Roma and Jewish women, were lined up and experimented on in groups, stripped of privacy and dignity. Many endured excruciating pain, severe infections, and irreversible damage to internal organs. Survivors later reported unbearable cramps, bleeding, and lifelong infertility. Some died from infections that raged unchecked in filthy conditions. To the SS, these deaths were irrelevant. They were simply failures in experimentation. Himmler's obsession with controlling reproduction turned women's bodies into battlegrounds of ideology. Fertility became a weapon of control, denied to those labeled unworthy. In the cold calculus of racial science, humanity was expendable. At Ravensbrück, a series of brutal bone, muscle, and nerve graft experiments became infamous for their cruelty. Between 1942 and 1943, dozens of young Polish women, later known as the Rabbits, were selected for these trials. Doctors deliberately shattered bones, removed muscles, or infected wounds with gangrene and dirt to simulate battlefield injuries. Victims screamed in agony as their legs were sliced open repeatedly, with no anesthetic to dull the torment. The women limped back to barracks, some carried by comrades, their bandages already soaked with blood. Many could not walk for months. Some never walked again. Yet they were forced to line up for roll calls, collapsing in mud while guards mocked their weakness. Death was common, either from infection or execution, when bodies became too frail. Those who survived carried lifelong scars etched deep into their skin and bones. The Rabbits became enduring symbols of both horror and resilience. The rationale for these graft experiments was cloaked in military logic. Nazi doctors claimed they were researching treatments for wounded German soldiers. In truth, prisoners were deemed expendable test animals, their suffering rationalized as a contribution to the war effort. Laboratories echoed with the sound of saws, hammers, and scalpels as women were mutilated in the name of progress. Reports were carefully logged, measurements of wounds recorded, infections monitored, but behind the numbers were human beings stripped of all agency. Prisoners knew they were not being healed but dismantled, piece by piece, for data that rarely had practical value. Even when results proved inconclusive, the experiments continued. The cruelty was relentless, with human endurance treated as a variable to be tested. Science became a mask for sadism, carried out in sterile rooms stained with blood. At Auschwitz, disease experiments formed another pillar of this brutality. Women were deliberately infected with typhus, tuberculosis, and malaria, diseases that already ravaged the camps. Infected prisoners were placed in overcrowded barracks, their conditions carefully monitored as epidemics spread. Doctors observed without providing adequate treatment, noting the pace of decline, the fevers, the deaths. Syringes carried not medicine but poison, delivering pathogens into veins under the pretense of research. Many women writhed in delirium, their bodies burning with fevers that consumed them within days. Others lingered in agony, reduced to skeletons before succumbing. Even survivors were left with permanent damage, their immune systems wrecked by repeated exposure. The experiments provided no genuine breakthroughs, only suffering catalogued in clinical language. Disease was weaponized as another method of destruction. The rabbits of Ravensbrück stood apart in history because of their remarkable resilience. Despite their shattered bodies, they formed networks of solidarity, hiding those too weak to stand from roll call. They whispered prayers, sang softly at night, and recorded names of the dead in scraps of paper and memory. Guards derided them as useless, yet their defiance endured in acts of survival. When ordered to reveal the injured, fellow prisoners concealed them in bunks, risking death for protection. As liberation approached, SS guards attempted to execute them, to erase evidence of the crimes. Yet many survived, limping into freedom with scars as living testimony. After the war, they spoke at trials, their broken limbs serving as proof of unspeakable crimes. Their story became one of both horror and defiance. In their suffering, they preserved a truth the Nazis tried to bury. The impact of these experiments extended far beyond physical wounds. Survivors bore lifelong pain, amputations, and disabilities that marked them as living reminders of brutality. Many could not bear children, their fertility stolen in sterile rooms under SS command. Psychological scars ran equally deep, as nightmares replayed the moment of the scalpel and the scream. Some survivors struggled to tell their stories, fearing disbelief or stigma in post-war societies. Others remained silent, carrying memories too heavy to release. Yet testimonies slowly emerged, revealing the truth in courtrooms, archives, and memoirs. Each account added weight to the record of crimes, denying deniers the comfort of silence. Historians pieced together these fragments, reconstructing the reality of Nazi science. The survivors' resilience gave the world evidence no denial could erase. Their pain became part of the world's memory. Today, the memory of these women stands preserved in museums, memorials, and history books. Ravensbrück's walls, scarred but still standing, echo with the footsteps of visitors who come to remember. The names of the rabbits are honored as symbols of courage amidst cruelty. In Auschwitz, the preserved barracks and exhibitions reveal the instruments of medicalized terror. These places remind us that medicine, when stripped of ethics, can become a tool of destruction. The story of these women is not only one of suffering, but of warning for generations to come. Their bodies bore the cost of ideology disguised as science. Their testimonies stand as evidence of how far cruelty can reach when humanity is denied. Remembering them is a duty, not an option. In their scars, history speaks with unflinching clarity. In the Nazi concentration camp system, women were not only prisoners, they became commodities for labor. From dawn until dusk, they were driven into factories, workshops, and quarries. their bodies treated as expendable tools of production. Nowhere was this more apparent than in the Siemens workshops, built alongside Ravensbrück, where thousands of women assembled electrical components for the German war machine. Each day, skeletal figures in striped uniforms filed into sterile halls, filled with machines humming with efficiency. Under the eyes of guards, they soldered, assembled, and wired instruments destined for aircraft, communications, and weaponry. The irony was bitter. Women who were starving and freezing built devices that extended the war, prolonging their own captivity. Labor was enforced with whips, shouted commands, and the looming presence of armed overseers. The SS profited, Siemens profited, but the workers received nothing but hunger and exhaustion. These workshops became factories of survival for some, but factories of death for countless others. The armament factories spread across the Reich and its occupied territories, drawing heavily on women deported from camps. Labor detachments left Ravensbrück, Auschwitz, and other camps daily, escorted by SS guards to nearby industries. In the vast complexes of IG Farben and Messerschmitt, women bent over machines for 12-hour shifts. Quarries demanded back-breaking toil as women hacked at stone with primitive tools under punishing weather. Others dug ditches, built fortifications, or carried bricks on their backs, collapsing under the weight. Starvation diets of watery soup and crumbs of bread fueled none of this, leaving bodies wasting away. The official policy was extermination through labor, where death by exhaustion was not a side effect, but an intended outcome. Productivity mattered only so long as bodies could still function. When they failed, replacements arrived in endless transports. Human life was reduced to a consumable resource, burned out and discarded. Inside the Siemens factories at Ravensbrück, conditions were both surreal and cruelly efficient. Women worked in clean, modern spaces, surrounded by equipment that contrasted starkly with the squalor of the camp barracks. Yet the polished machinery offered no reprieve, only a different form of exploitation. Guards patrolled between rows of prisoners, striking those whose hands slowed or faltered. The work required precision, but exhaustion made mistakes inevitable, leading to brutal punishments. Hunger clawed at concentration, dizziness blurred vision, and fainting at machines was common. Accidents mangled fingers, burned skin, or blinded eyes, yet treatment was minimal. At the end of each shift, women marched back through gates, their pockets searched for stolen scraps of wire or food. They returned to barracks too weak to stand, yet still dragged out for roll call. For Siemens, production quotas were met. For the prisoners' survival was a battle against both machines and starvation. Labor detachments extended beyond factories into the very infrastructure of Nazi Germany. Women were forced to build roads, airfields, and bunkers, working with picks and shovels under relentless supervision. The sight of emaciated prisoners digging trenches along country roads was familiar to local civilians. Many residents looked away. Some offered scraps of food, but most remained silent. The SS ensured that labor detachments remained visible, a living reminder of Nazi power over conquered peoples. Women marched through towns in striped uniforms, their skeletal figures a warning to anyone considering defiance. The degradation was public as well as physical, stripping dignity in the eyes of both captors and civilians. Yet even under the gaze of strangers, women carried stones, swung hammers, and hauled logs until collapse. Few tasks were too menial, none were too cruel. Each stroke of the shovel was another step in a calculated system of annihilation. The complicity of German corporations was not hidden but institutionalized. Siemens, IG Farben, Daimler-Benz, and Krupp, all signed contracts with the SS to secure labor from the camps. These companies received thousands of women prisoners, delivered like shipments of raw material. Records show payments made directly to the SS, who profited enormously from renting out human beings. For industry, the arrangement was cost-effective: no wages, no protections, no rights. For the SS, it provided both revenue and a method of slow extermination. Women bent over machinery in aircraft factories or stood in freezing fields of chemical plants, all for corporations whose profits swelled during war. These partnerships blurred the line between military ambition and corporate greed. Businessmen in suits shook hands with officers in black uniforms, sealing contracts that condemned women to suffering. The factories became extensions of the camps themselves. Every machine hummed with the sound of complicity. The physical toll of this forced labor was immense and immediate. Starvation diets provided fewer than 800 calories a day, barely half of what was needed for survival. Women worked with swollen ankles, open sores and broken bones, their health crumbling with each shift. In quarries, rock dust choked lungs. In chemical plants, fumes burned eyes and skin. Frostbite claimed fingers and toes in winter, while heat stroke felled workers in summer. Exhaustion became constant, an ache that never lifted, only deepened. Those who collapsed were beaten to their feet or dragged away to infirmaries where death awaited. Some women deliberately slowed their pace, sabotaging production at the risk of execution. Others fought to maintain rhythm, clinging to survival even as their bodies failed. Every hour of labor was both a test and a torment. For the prisoners, work was the slow march of destruction. Amid this cruelty, acts of quiet defiance emerged. Even in the heart of the factories, women sabotaged equipment by miswiring circuits, dulling tools, or assembling parts incorrectly. These acts of resistance risked immediate execution, yet they persisted, carried out in whispers of solidarity. Some smuggled messages to civilian workers, who in rare cases slipped bread or news in return. A broken machine might delay production for hours, a small victory in a system bent on annihilation. Such acts reminded prisoners that their spirit was not entirely crushed. Survival itself became resistance, a refusal to give the Nazis complete control over body and will. In the silence of the factory floor, women fought a war of attrition with courage unseen by the outside world. Even in exhaustion, they carved spaces for defiance. Each mistake, each delay, was a hidden declaration of humanity. The factories were not only sites of exploitation, but also of quiet resistance. By war's end, forced labor had claimed the lives of countless women across the Reich. Factories, quarries, and workshops had consumed bodies as efficiently as they produced weapons. Survivors emerged skeletal, scarred, and broken, their labor having sustained both the German military and corporate empires. The complicity of industry remained a shadow over post-war justice, as many companies denied or minimized their roles. Yet the stories of women prisoners revealed the truth that survival was purchased with pain and exploitation. Ravensbrück's Siemens halls, Auschwitz's IG Farben complex, and hundreds of other sites became synonymous with slavery. These factories of death blurred the line between camp and industry, showing that destruction could wear the mask of labor. For the women who endured, every machine, every tool, every shift carried memories of suffering. Their testimony preserved the truth that profit and cruelty walked hand in hand. Forced labor was not an accident of war. It was its engine. Among the countless victims of the Nazi regime, the Roma and Cinti, often derogatorily called gypsies, suffered persecution that was both systematic and merciless. Labeled as racially inferior, they were targeted for extermination alongside Jews, political prisoners, and others deemed undesirable. For Roma women and children, the impact was particularly devastating, as their families were uprooted in entire groups. Communities were torn from wagons, villages, and campsites, herded onto trains under armed guard. Many arrived at Auschwitz, where a section was designated the Gypsy Family Camp, known officially as Zigeunerlager. Here, entire families were held together, a cruel deception that hid their eventual fate. Women carried infants on their hips. Daughters stood beside fathers, all still together behind barbed wire. The illusion of family unity provided false comfort, masking the death machine that loomed ahead. For Roma women, survival was entangled with protecting children and kin in impossible circumstances. Their story is a crucial, though often overlooked, part of the Holocaust. Inside the gypsy camp at Auschwitz, conditions mirrored the horror of the rest of Birkenau, but with unique cruelties. Over 20,000 Roma and Cinti were crammed into this section between 1943 and 1944. Barracks overflowed with families, overcrowded to the point of suffocation. Sanitation was non-existent, with sewage ditches running through living areas and disease spreading unchecked. Typhus, dysentery, and measles ravaged children who died by the hundreds each week. Mothers were forced to watch helplessly as infants wasted away with no medicine and barely enough food to survive themselves. Guards mocked their suffering, reinforcing the belief that Roma lives were worth nothing. Women tried desperately to shield their children, offering scraps of bread or smuggled potatoes, yet every act of care was met by the overwhelming reality of starvation and disease. The camp was not a place of family preservation, it was a slow-motion extermination ground. Pregnancy in the gypsy camp became a sentence of both fear and despair. Women who gave birth inside Auschwitz were offered no medical care, no clean bedding, and no nourishment to sustain themselves. Newborns, frail and malnourished, often died within days. Some were deliberately killed by camp authorities, drowned in buckets, or left exposed to cold. Mothers clung to their infants, trying to warm them with their own emaciated bodies, but their efforts were in vain. SS doctors, including Joseph Mengele, prowled the gypsy camp, selecting children and women for grotesque experiments. Twins were singled out, their bodies subjected to injections, dissections, and endless tests. Women were sterilized through chemical injections or crude surgeries, destroying their fertility and leaving lasting pain. Pregnancy, once a symbol of life, became a weaponized site of destruction. In Auschwitz, motherhood itself was criminalized, punished with cruelty and despair. Despite this environment of death, Roma women fought to preserve dignity and solidarity. They created makeshift cradles from scraps of wood, sang traditional lullabies to soothe frightened children, and shared every crumb of food they could hide. Stories circulated around fires, whispered in the dark, reminding children of life beyond barbed wire. Cultural identity became a fragile shield, one that the SS tried relentlessly to erase. Women braided each other's hair, told fortunes with scraps of cards, and taught songs in Romani dialects. These rituals, however small, were acts of resistance against dehumanization. In their traditions, women preserved a fragment of the world that the Nazis sought to obliterate. Survival was not measured only in breath, but in memory, in the ability to cling to identity. Each act of cultural preservation was defiance, however dangerous. For Roma women to keep their heritage alive was to strike back at erasure. The climax of the Roma tragedy came in August 1944, when the gypsy family camp at Auschwitz was liquidated. In one night, nearly 3,000 Roma men, women, and children were marched to the gas chambers. Survivors recalled mothers clutching children as guards pried them away, forcing families to the edge of death together. Screams echoed through the night, silenced only by the hiss of Zyklon B in sealed chambers. Few Roma prisoners survived the liquidation. Those who did had been transferred earlier to labor detachments. Women and children perished in overwhelming numbers, their voices erased in an instant. This mass killing was part of what Roma communities later called the porajmos, or the devouring. Yet, unlike the Jewish Holocaust, their suffering was long denied recognition. The Gypsy camp's liquidation stands as one of the Holocaust's least acknowledged massacres. For Roma women, it was the night their families vanished in smoke. After liberation, the suffering of Roma and Cinti women remained largely invisible in public memory. Many survivors returned to communities that had been destroyed or displaced, only to face continued discrimination. Governments across Europe denied reparations, claiming Roma persecution had been incidental rather than systematic. Women who survived often carried not only trauma, but also the stigma of being doubly marginalized, once by the Nazis and again by society. Their testimonies were rarely recorded, their losses overshadowed by other narratives of war. Some lived in silence, passing trauma down through families in unspoken ways. Others spoke out late in life, demanding that their suffering be recognized alongside that of other victims. Yet for decades, Roma voices remained absent from history books, museums, and trials. The erasure compounded the original violence, silencing survivors a second time. Memory itself became a battleground for justice. The psychological scars endured by Roma women were profound, etched into both body and spirit. Survivors recounted endless nightmares of children torn away, of the sound of boots on gravel, of smoke-filled skies. Many never overcame the guilt of surviving when entire families had perished. Their resilience was remarkable, but it came at the cost of lifelong pain. Cultural transmission was disrupted, as mothers who once taught language, music, and tradition returned to fractured communities. Families rebuilt in poverty, often forced into the same marginalization they had known before the war. In some cases, survivors chose silence, fearing renewed persecution if they spoke of their past. The trauma of Auschwitz thus lived on not only in individuals, but in entire generations. Children of survivors inherited the silence, carrying wounds they could not name. For Roma women, survival was not only about life after liberation, it was about bearing the unbearable. Today, the memory of Roma and Cinti women in the camps is slowly being reclaimed. Memorials at Auschwitz now acknowledge the Gypsy family camp, giving names and faces back to those erased survivors' testimonies, once hidden, are preserved in archives and documentaries, their voices finally breaking decades of silence. Scholars and activists highlight the Porajmos as a genocide equal in brutality, demanding justice for forgotten victims. Women who once whispered songs in barracks are honored as cultural keepers who defied annihilation. Their legacy teaches us that persecution does not end with liberation, but continues in silence and neglect. By remembering their suffering, we restore a truth denied for too long. The Roma women of Auschwitz stand as symbols of resilience in the face of erasure. Their story expands the meaning of the Holocaust, reminding us that no victim should be forgotten. To tell their story is to return their dignity. Even in the darkest corners of the camps, where death loomed daily and despair seemed absolute, women found ways to resist. Resistance did not always mean armed revolt, but survival strategies born of courage and defiance. In barracks where rations were scarce, women secretly divided crusts of bread and shared watery soup with those weaker than themselves. These small acts of generosity undermined the SS's attempt to reduce prisoners to selfish survival. Networks of trust formed in whispers, passed hand to hand in the shadows of guard towers, Smuggling items from medicine to scraps of fabric became lifelines for many. Women risked beatings and execution to hide these treasures beneath rags or in hems of dresses. Even the act of comforting the dying with a song or prayer became resistance, preserving humanity against calculated dehumanization. Each act of solidarity echoed louder than the silence of submission. Resistance thrived in places where the SS never expected it in compassion. Smuggling networks inside the camps operated with astonishing ingenuity. Women who worked in kitchens sometimes slipped peels of potatoes or onions into their sleeves. Those assigned to warehouses pilfered thread, bandages, or soap to aid the sick. In Ravensbrück, women working in Siemens factories deliberately concealed small tools, hoping they might one day aid escape or sabotage. At Auschwitz, others hid medicines stolen from SS infirmaries, distributing them secretly among the fevered and the weak. These supplies were precious, worth more than gold in a world where illness was a death sentence. Women devised elaborate signals, often with nods or coded phrases, to avoid detection. When guards searched barracks, hidden caches were moved quickly from one bed to another. Every successful theft, no matter how small, was an act of defiance. Smuggling kept alive not just bodies, but also the spirit of resistance. Sabotage was another form of defiance, carried out with a quiet, deliberate precision. In armament factories, women miswired circuits, dulled blades, or spoiled mixtures in chemical vats. At Siemens in Ravensbrück, prisoners slowed production deliberately, knowing that a faulty component could cost the Reich precious time and resources. In Auschwitz, women smuggled gunpowder from the munitions plant at great personal risk. This gunpowder was later used in the October 1944 Sonderkommando uprising, when prisoners blew up a crematorium. The contribution of women to this uprising has often been overlooked, yet it was their courage that made it possible. Even when sabotage meant death if caught, women persisted, driven by the knowledge that each act chipped away at Nazi control. For some, the risk was worth the price. For resistance was dignity itself. Tools became weapons, and weakness became strength in the shadows of the factory floor. Their sabotage turned forced labor into subversion. Organized networks formed among women of different nationalities and backgrounds. In Ravensbrück, Polish, French, and German political prisoners forged bonds that transcended language barriers. Hand gestures, scraps of writing, and whispered translations carried vital messages across cultures. In Auschwitz, Jewish, Roma, and Slavic women created small circles of trust, trading survival tips and smuggling strategies. The diversity of the camps made unity difficult, but necessity forged alliances. Some women shared not only food but also knowledge, teaching languages, prayers, and even songs to pass time and preserve sanity. These networks became underground schools of resistance, where survival and memory were intertwined. Leadership often emerged organically, with the strongest guiding the weakest, through brutal selections and roll calls. Solidarity across borders became a weapon stronger than the SS's whips. Where the Nazis tried to divide, women resisted by uniting. Acts of defiance were not always material. They were also deeply symbolic. Women maintained small rituals of culture and faith in defiance of Nazi orders. At great risk, they whispered prayers, sang lullabies, or recited poetry in barracks at night. Some marked holidays in secret, lighting makeshift candles or hiding scraps of bread for symbolic meals. These acts reminded them of who they were before the camp stripped them of names and dignity. In Ravensbrück, a secret choir of women sang forbidden songs, their voices weaving defiance into the night air. In Auschwitz, Others scratched names and prayers into walls, determined to leave traces of existence. Even a smile, a joke, or a touch of a hand became revolutionary in a world designed to extinguish hope. To endure with identity intact was the boldest defiance of all. Resistance was measured not only in weapons, but in the will to remain human. Courage often emerged in moments of unbearable danger. When guards attempted to separate the sick for transport, women sometimes exchanged identities, saving those too weak to stand. Some volunteered for labor details in place of others, knowing the assignments could mean death. Others concealed pregnant women or mothers with infants, risking their own safety for the vulnerable. There are recorded stories of women standing together in lines, refusing to betray comrades even under beatings. In one case at Auschwitz, a group of women shielded a friend from an SS officer, absorbing blows themselves. These were not grand uprisings, but quiet revolutions of loyalty, echoing through whispered oaths and clasped hands. Defiance lay not in defeating the Nazis, but in refusing to be broken by them. Each act was a spark of humanity in a night of brutality. In unity, women found their shield. In courage, they found their voice. The cost of resistance was often death, yet women accepted this risk with remarkable resolve. Those caught smuggling were hanged before their comrades as a warning. Saboteurs were beaten, shot, or sent to punishment blocks, from which few returned. Yet even these deaths carried a message that the SS could not silence. When 4 women were executed in Auschwitz for smuggling gunpowder to the Sonderkommando, their final words were cries of defiance. Witnesses remembered their courage as a testament to unbroken will. Their sacrifice inspired others, proving that resistance was not futile. The Nazis could destroy bodies, but not the idea of resistance itself. In their deaths, these women carved legacies of bravery into the history of the camps. Resistance, even when crushed, lived on as memory and inspiration. Looking back, the resistance of women in the camps stands as one of the most powerful forms of defiance against tyranny. Their networks, their sabotage, their compassion created islands of humanity in oceans of cruelty. Every stolen crumb of bread, every sabotaged bullet, every whispered song was a weapon wielded against oppression. The camps were designed to break individuals into silence and submission, yet women created communities of survival. These acts remind us that resistance takes many forms, often quiet, often unseen, but no less heroic. Their courage shows that defiance is not only measured in guns or battles, but in the preservation of dignity under inhuman conditions. The women who resisted carried forward a truth stronger than the barbed wire that caged them. They left behind not only scars, but also examples of resilience that echo through generations. To remember them is to honor resistance itself. Their defiance proves that even in death camps, humanity could not be extinguished. Few roles in the camps carried such unbearable weight as those forced upon women near the gas chambers. While most Sonderkommando were men, a small number of women were compelled into similar duties, working in proximity to industrialized murder. Their labor included cleaning barracks, where condemned prisoners had waited, sorting through clothing of the dead, and burning belongings in massive pits. Women were sometimes ordered to remove hair from corpses, a grotesque task performed under SS watch. These assignments left no illusion. They were made to serve as accessories to the machinery of death. The torment of such work was psychological as much as physical, stripping away hope and crushing spirits. To survive meant participating, however unwillingly, in processes designed to erase entire communities. Yet even within this hell, women tried to shield one another from despair. They whispered encouragement, clung to solidarity, and resisted being reduced to tools of destruction. The psychological burden of witnessing mass murder was indescribable. Women forced into these labor units heard the cries from gas chambers, the pounding of fists on sealed doors, the silence that followed. Every day they saw the piles of shoes, coats, and suitcases belonging to families who no longer lived. The stench of burning flesh from crematoria hung permanently in the air, searing itself into memory. Guards barked orders with casual cruelty, as if the work were no different than cleaning a factory floor. For the women trapped in this role, survival came at the cost of living with unbearable knowledge. They were not only prisoners, they were witnesses to the annihilation of millions. Many later described feeling as if they died a little with every transport. Survival in such conditions was not a triumph, it was a lifelong sentence of memory. After each gassing, belongings of the murdered were hauled into vast warehouses, cynically called Canada by the SS. Here women prisoners were forced to sort through mountains of clothing, toys, photographs, and household goods. Every object was a reminder of lives erased, a testament to the scale of theft and extermination. Mothers recognized children's shoes the size of their own child's feet. Some whispered silent prayers over piles of tiny garments before being shoved away by guards. The work was endless, mechanical, yet every item carried the weight of absence. For the Nazis it was simply recycling for the Reich. For the women it was daily torment. They worked with trembling hands, aware that they touched the last remnants of murdered families. To endure was to numb the heart, yet numbness never fully came. Each shift left wounds deeper than any whip. Yet in the same camps where death was industrialized, music was forced into service of cruelty. Women's orchestras were formed in camps like Auschwitz and Ravensbrück, their instruments salvaged or stolen from deportees. Female prisoners with musical talent were recruited to play marches, waltzes, and popular songs. As columns of prisoners trudged to labor, or more chillingly, to gas chambers, the orchestras played. Violins, cellos, and clarinets filled the air with melodies that mocked the silence of death. Women musicians often described the horror of watching others march to annihilation while their own hands produced sound. Their survival depended on performance, yet each note was soaked in contradiction. To play was to live, to refuse was to die. The orchestra became a cruel shield, protecting its members while binding them to tragedy. Music, once a source of joy, became an accomplice to despair. The most infamous of these was the Women's Orchestra of Auschwitz, conducted first by Zofia Czajkowska and later by Alma Rose, a Viennese violinist of great renown. Under Alma's leadership, discipline and skill turned the group into a polished ensemble. They rehearsed constantly, not out of artistic devotion, but because failure meant death. Women of different nations, languages, and backgrounds were forced into harmony, their lives tied to instruments. They played as prisoners departed for labor, their music a grim accompaniment to exhaustion. At times they were ordered to perform as new arrivals, march to selections, masking the screams with melodies. Alma Rose demanded perfection, knowing it was the only way to keep her players alive. The orchestra's sound became a grotesque soundtrack to genocide. Yet within its ranks, women clung to one another, creating fragile bonds of survival. For some, the orchestra was both curse and salvation. Life in the orchestra carried its own strange contradictions. Compared to other prisoners, the musicians received marginally better food, less brutal labor, and occasional protection from selections. Yet these privileges were poisoned by guilt, for they knew survival came through performance at others' expense. Women wrestled with the question, was living under such terms truly survival, or simply prolonging agony? Instruments became extensions of their suffering, each bowstroke on the violin string a reminder of compromise. Some musicians later recalled moments of transcendent beauty when they played brief escapes from camp horror. Yet these moments were fleeting, swallowed by the reality that music was weaponized against fellow prisoners. The SS delighted in the spectacle, ordering performances for their amusement. For the women, every rehearsal was a rehearsal for survival itself. They lived between notes, between despair and the faint hope of endurance. Beyond orchestras, acts of resistance sometimes emerged even in these grim roles. In the Canada warehouses, women smuggled food or clothing to the sick, hiding items in their uniforms. Some musicians deliberately stretched pieces to delay marches or played with solemnity rather than cheer, asserting fragments of defiance. A violin bow lowered too slowly, a tempo drawn out. It was resistance wrapped in melody. Women risked discovery, knowing the SS punished even the smallest deviation. Yet these acts mattered, preserving a sliver of control in an environment designed for total domination. To resist openly was impossible. To resist quietly was everything. Courage was measured in whispers, glances, and unspoken solidarity. Even under the gaze of guards, women found ways to remain human. In defiance, they reclaimed fragments of dignity. The legacy of women in Sonderkommando roles and orchestras remains one of the Holocaust's most haunting paradoxes. They were prisoners trapped in survival roles that tethered them to death's machinery, yet their testimonies illuminate the full horror of the camps. Their stories show us that survival was not clean or triumphant. It was complicated, burdened, and forever scarred. Music, once a universal symbol of life, was twisted into a weapon of control. Labor, once a means of productivity, became a form of destruction. Women bore these contradictions in silence, often for decades after liberation. Only later did survivors begin to speak, breaking taboos of guilt and shame to tell their truths. Today, their voices remind us that even in places designed to erase humanity, the human spirit endured. They carried melodies through fire, leaving echoes that history cannot silence. In their testimony, the dead still speak. While women in the camps endured starvation, brutality, and degradation, other women stood on the opposite side of the barbed wire. They were not prisoners but SS overseers, recruited to enforce terror within Ravensbrück, Auschwitz, Majdanek, and other camps. By 1945, nearly 3,700 women served as guards, wielding authority over tens of thousands of female prisoners. Their roles were extensions of Nazi ideology, proving that cruelty was not limited by gender. Trained in special courses, these women learned how to command, punish, and break spirits with ruthless efficiency. They carried whips, sticks, and snarling dogs, symbols of their newfound power. Some were young, barely out of adolescence, while others were wives and mothers who left families at home to serve the Reich. To the prisoners, their presence was no less terrifying than that of male SS officers. These women became enforcers of a system that devoured lives daily. Their story is a reminder that oppression had many faces. Ravensbrück, the largest women's concentration camp, became the primary training ground for female SS guards. Here, young recruits were drilled in discipline, ideology, and brutality. Overseers learned to issue commands with cold precision, to enforce punishments without hesitation, and to maintain control over thousands of desperate women. Graduates of Ravensbrück were then dispatched to satellite camps across the Reich. They became overseers in armament factories, labor camps, and extermination sites, extending the reach of SS terror. Prisoners recalled how these guards patrolled barracks, barking orders and striking without warning. The guards' uniforms gave them status, and their authority was absolute within the camp fences. For many of them, cruelty became routine, a daily performance of dominance. Some adapted reluctantly, others embraced violence with disturbing zeal. Ravensbrück thus produced not only prisoners but perpetrators. Among the most infamous of these women was Irma Grace, later called the Beast of Belsen. Barely in her 20s, she rose quickly through the ranks as a guard at Ravensbrück, Auschwitz-Birkenau, and Bergen-Belsen. Survivors described her as both striking in appearance and monstrous in behavior. She carried a whip and a pistol, using them with merciless enthusiasm. Prisoners recounted how she unleashed dogs on women, or beat them to unconsciousness for minor infractions. Gracie was feared not only for her violence, but also for her calculated cruelty, often smiling as she inflicted pain. Her youth made her sadism all the more shocking, a symbol of how ideology could corrupt so completely. After the war, she stood trial at Belsen, her crimes exposed in chilling testimony. She was sentenced to death and hanged at age 22. Irma Grace remains one of history's most notorious female perpetrators. Another name synonymous with cruelty was Ilse Koch, the Witch of Buchenwald. As the wife of Commandant Karl Koch, she wielded extraordinary influence in the camp. Prisoners accused her of sadistic acts, including beatings, humiliations, and selections for death. She became infamous for her alleged obsession with tattooed skin, with rumors that she had human hides turned into lampshades or ornaments. Whether myth or truth, these stories reflected the terror she inspired among prisoners. Survivors remembered her riding horseback through camp, whipping inmates at random. She embodied both privilege and perversion, using her position to exploit and torment the powerless. After the war, she too faced trial, though her punishment sparked controversy for being lighter than many expected. Her legacy endures as a chilling reminder of how cruelty could be normalized in positions of unchecked authority. Koch became a symbol of female complicity in atrocities. Not all female guards achieved such notoriety, but countless others inflicted daily violence. Overseers supervised roll calls that dragged on for hours in snow or rain, watching as women collapsed and died at their feet. They enforced food rations, beating those who scavenged extra scraps. Punishments included whipping, forced exercise until collapse, or locking prisoners in standing cells with no room to move. Guards laughed at the suffering, treating pain as both entertainment and discipline. Dogs were trained to attack at the flick of a hand. The brutality did not require spectacle. It was woven into the fabric of daily camp life. For prisoners, the guards became constant reminders of domination, present in every barracks, factory, and work detail. These women wielded absolute power over life and death, often with chilling indifference. Their cruelty left scars deeper than barbed wire. The motivations of female guards were complex but grounded in ideology and opportunity. Many came from working-class backgrounds, seeking employment and advancement in a regime that promised them purpose. The SS offered uniforms, authority, and a sense of belonging to something larger than themselves. Indoctrination taught them to view prisoners as less than human, erasing empathy. Some internalized this ideology fully, embracing violence as duty. Others found power intoxicating, wielding it with sadistic pleasure. A few may have felt unease but continued out of fear of punishment or loss of position. Yet history shows that many did far more than obey orders. They committed atrocities willingly. The machinery of the camps required not only male officers, but women who chose to become its gears. Their presence reveals the reach of complicity in systems of oppression. After liberation, the image of female guards shocked the world. Trials at places like Belsen and Ravensbrück revealed not only male brutality, but also female participation in the machinery of death. Survivors testified to whippings, shootings, and selections carried out by women in uniform. Some perpetrators attempted to claim innocence, portraying themselves as victims of circumstance. But witnesses remembered their cruelty too vividly for such defences to stand. Irma Gress, Elizabeth Volkenrath, and other guards were sentenced to death for their crimes. Others received prison terms, though many escaped justice entirely. Post-war societies struggled to confront the reality that women had not only suffered but also inflicted suffering. The trials forced the world to acknowledge that brutality knows no gender. In the dock, female guards faced the same judgment as their male counterparts. The story of female SS guards complicates our understanding of gender in war and atrocity. Women are often remembered as victims, yet here we see them as perpetrators, oppressors, and active participants in genocide. Their cruelty was not an aberration, but a reflection of the system that empowered them. For prisoners, the whip of a woman stung no less than that of a man. The sight of a guard in uniform, whether male or female, was a symbol of domination and fear. Today, their legacy reminds us that evil is not bound by gender, age, or background. It emerges wherever ideology erases empathy and grants unchecked power. Remembering these women is essential, not to sensationalize, but to understand the full spectrum of complicity. In their brutality, they revealed the banality of evil in its starkest form. The camps were not built by men alone. In the barren landscape of the camps, where life was reduced to numbers and death was routine, women fought to preserve their humanity. Survival was not only a matter of food or labor, but of spirit and dignity. Prayer, art, storytelling, and bonds of sisterhood became invisible weapons against despair. At night, women whispered psalms or fragments of prayers remembered from childhood. Others clung to rosaries made from string, or to scraps of cloth, embroidered secretly with symbols of faith. Even in barracks where guards demanded silence, lips moved silently, reciting words of belief in defiance of cruelty. Art, too, emerged in hidden corners, as women sketched faces in dust or carved small designs into scraps of wood. Each act reminded them that they were more than prisoners. They were human beings with souls and memories. Faith and creativity became sanctuaries stronger than walls. They were the unseen resistance, keeping hope alive where nothing else could. Storytelling was one of the most powerful tools of endurance. Around bunks, women told tales of home, of children waiting, of meals once shared at family tables. These stories were not fantasies but bridges back to the world before barbed wire. They restored a sense of identity, reminding listeners of who they were beyond the striped uniforms. Stories of folklore and tradition carried culture into the camp, preserving heritage when everything else was being stripped away. In Auschwitz, Polish women recited poetry in secret, while Roma women sang songs that echoed in the night air. Even jokes were shared, small bursts of laughter that pierced the monotony of despair. Humor, however brief, was a shield against fear and hunger. To tell a story was to refuse silence, to affirm life in the shadow of death. Storytelling bound women together in threads of memory and hope. Faith endured not only through prayer, but also through ritual, often improvised in secrecy. Women marked the Sabbath by whispering blessings over crumbs of bread, or lighting invisible candles with their hands cupped in the dark. Christian women murmured prayers at dawn, crossing themselves quickly before guards could see. For many, faith was not only a spiritual comfort, but a declaration of survival. It asserted that beyond the fences lay a greater truth, a divine justice stronger than the SS. Even when belief wavered, rituals offered structure, a rhythm in a world stripped of order. Faith united women across boundaries of language and nationality. A whispered hymn, a murmured prayer, or a moment of silent reflection became acts of defiance. The barracks turned into cathedrals of resilience, lit not by candles but by the flame of hope. Faith transformed despair into endurance. Bonds of sisterhood were forged in the crucible of suffering. Women became mothers to the orphaned, sisters to the abandoned, friends to the lonely. They held one another upright during roll calls, shared scraps of bread, and nursed the sick when strength was gone. These surrogate families offered emotional lifelines where biological families had been torn apart. At Ravensbrück, survivors recalled how one woman would give her only potato peel to a weaker comrade, insisting, "You must live." In Auschwitz, women braided each other's hair, restoring dignity even as lice and filth spread around them. Friendship became a form of resistance, a refusal to let cruelty erase compassion. These bonds often determined who survived and who did not. To be alone was to be vulnerable, to be connected was to endure. Sisterhood was survival, written in gestures of love amidst horror. Psychological endurance required strategies beyond faith and companionship. Women created mental refuges, recalling the smell of kitchens, the touch of loved ones, the sounds of home. Some memorized poetry or sang songs silently, replaying them in their minds during endless roll calls. Others constructed imaginary meals, savoring each remembered flavor as if eating in truth. Mental escape was vital, for despair could kill faster than hunger. To imagine survival was to lay claim to a future beyond the camp. For some, the thought of reunion with children or parents became the spark that sustained them. Others clung to dreams of justice, of seeing their oppressors brought low. These inner visions gave women strength to take one more step, to endure one more day. Survival was not only physical but psychological, built on imagination as much as endurance. Hope lived in the mind when the body faltered. Creativity was another lifeline. Women used soot, charcoal, or scraps of paper to sketch, often hiding their drawings beneath mattresses or in cracks of barracks. Others embroidered small cloths, with threads pulled from uniforms, sewing patterns of flowers, stars, or initials. In Ravensbrück, a clandestine school emerged, where women taught each other languages, history, and mathematics. Knowledge became rebellion, an insistence that education could not be eradicated by barbed wire. Even scraps of song became vessels of endurance, carried in low voices when guards were not listening. Each creation was both fragile and monumental, proof that spirit could not be crushed. Women risked death to keep art alive, for they knew art was humanity itself. The guards could command bodies, but not imagination. Creativity made survival meaningful, not just possible. In art, women left their fingerprints on history. Acts of hope often came in the smallest gestures, unseen by guards but unforgettable to survivors. A woman slipping half her bread to another, knowing it might mean her own hunger. A whispered word of encouragement during a brutal march, reminding someone to keep going. A song hummed softly in the dark, soothing dozens of restless souls in one barracks. Hope thrived in these intimate exchanges, where solidarity became stronger than fear. Survivors later recalled that it was not strength alone but kindness that saved them. Those who received kindness carried it forward, passing it on to others like a flame. In this way, hope was contagious, spreading even in the bleakest corners of the camps. The SS could not stamp it out, no matter how hard they tried. In the end, hope became a rebellion. No whip could silence. Looking back, the endurance of women in the camps was not merely a story of survival. It was a story of faith, hope, and resilience. Through prayer, they found strength in unseen worlds. Through storytelling, they reclaimed memory, Through art they preserved humanity. Bonds of sisterhood gave them purpose, while psychological strategies kept them alive one day longer. Survival was never guaranteed, but these acts gave meaning even in despair. They remind us that the Holocaust was not only a story of destruction but also of resistance through spirit. To hold on to dignity in a place designed to erase it was itself an act of defiance. These women carried hope through hunger, disease, and cruelty, leaving legacies of resilience. Their survival is testimony that even in humanity's darkest night, light flickered still. Hope, faith, and courage endured, and with them the human soul. Among the most heartbreaking aspects of the women's camps were the children, infants, toddlers, and young girls caught in a system designed to erase them. From the moment of arrival, families were torn apart on the selection ramp. Mothers clutching babies were sent to one side, while older children were sometimes pulled away, screaming, into the hands of guards. Many were killed immediately, deemed unfit for labor, and therefore of no use to the Reich. Yet in certain camps, small groups of children were kept alive, often hidden within women's barracks. Mothers, sisters, and strangers took on the role of protectors, concealing infants under straw mattresses or holding them close during roll calls. Every breath these children took was a triumph of secrecy and sacrifice. Their presence was both a blessing and a constant terror, for discovery often meant death for both child and caretaker. The existence of children in the camps was a paradox, innocent surrounded by absolute cruelty. In Ravensbrück and Auschwitz, children became subjects of unimaginable experiments. SS doctors saw them not as human beings, but as opportunities for twisted science. At Auschwitz, twins were selected for experiments under Joseph Mengele, their bodies injected with chemicals, dissected, and measured in grotesque pursuits of racial ideology. In Ravensbrück, young girls endured bone graft and sterilization experiments, leaving them crippled or infertile. Some were deliberately infected with diseases, their suffering documented as data in medical notebooks. For these children, play and laughter were replaced by pain and terror inside sterile laboratories of cruelty. Their cries echoed in barracks, yet no comfort could be given without risking punishment. Even the women who tried to care for them could not shield them from the hands of the SS. Childhood itself became an experiment, manipulated and destroyed. The innocence of youth was devoured by ideology masquerading as science. The mass killing of children was systematic, carried out with chilling efficiency. Babies born inside camps were often killed immediately, drowned, suffocated, or taken from their mothers without explanation. Older children deemed unfit for labor were sent directly to the gas chambers. In Auschwitz-Birkenau, entire transports of Roma children were gassed during the liquidation of the so-called Gypsy family camp in August 1944. Witnesses recalled the heart-rending sight of mothers trying to shield their little ones as they were driven toward the chimneys. The SS saw no value in nurturing the next generation of undesirables, erasing them en masse. Even in Ravensbrück, where a few children survived longer, starvation and disease decimated their numbers. Orphan children were left to wander barracks, clinging to older women who became surrogate mothers. Yet few of these bonds lasted beyond the next selection. Childhood became the first casualty of Nazi policy. For the women prisoners, children represented both hope and unbearable burden. Mothers risked everything to smuggle food to their children, hiding crusts of bread in rags or pockets. Some breastfed infants even when their own bodies were skeletal, offering nourishment pulled from starvation. Other women, childless themselves, became guardians to orphans, sharing scraps and whispering lullabies at night. These makeshift families brought moments of tenderness into a world built on cruelty. Yet each day brought fear of betrayal, for a crying baby could expose them all. Guards punished women mercilessly when children were discovered, often making examples of them before others. Still, the instinct to protect never disappeared. Women risked death for the chance to preserve a child's life for even a single day longer. Love in the camps was resistance itself. The survival of children depended largely on secrecy and chance. Some were hidden in the shadows of barracks, shielded by groups of women who stood around them during roll calls. Others disguised older girls as laborers, smudging their faces with dirt to make them look older and stronger. Babies were sometimes lulled into silence during inspections, their mothers pressing hands over tiny mouths in desperate prayers. When transports were divided, women sometimes lied about children's ages, hoping to save them from instant death. Small miracles did occur, though they were rare. A guard might turn a blind eye, or a labor overseer might decide not to ask questions. Yet more often, chance was cruel, and discovery brought execution. Survival was a thread spun from secrecy, luck, and endless courage. For the children who endured, their survival was as miraculous as it was fragile. Those who survived the camps as children carried scars that never healed. Liberation did not bring back parents lost in the gas chambers or siblings taken in the night. Many emerged as orphans scattered across Europe, carrying only memories of hunger, fear, and silence. Some were adopted, growing into adulthood haunted by fragments of trauma. Others lived in displaced persons camps, too young to understand why their families had vanished. Nightmares plagued them for decades, as images of chimneys, roll calls, and screaming guards replayed endlessly. Survivors later described feeling robbed not only of childhood, but of identity itself. Many never learned their true family names or places of origin. For them, the Holocaust did not end with liberation. It lived on in every lost memory and scar. Childhood, once stolen, could never be returned. Testimonies from child survivors became some of the most haunting records of the Holocaust. They spoke of being hidden in straw, of being carried under coats, of clinging to women who were not their mothers. They remembered the smells of smoke and the endless hunger that defined their earliest years. Some recalled lullabies whispered in barracks, words of comfort that survived even as the singers perished. Others remembered silence, the silence of mothers too weak to speak, of children too terrified to cry. These voices, fragile but unbroken, gave history an unfiltered perspective on atrocity. They revealed not only the cruelty of the camps, but the resilience of innocence. To listen to them is to hear echoes of both unimaginable loss and remarkable survival. Their testimonies remain a sacred inheritance of truth. The presence of children in the women's camps remains one of history's most devastating paradoxes. They were symbols of life, innocence, and future, yet trapped in places designed to extinguish all three. Their short lives, or the long shadows of survival, bear witness to the full cruelty of Nazi ideology. Women risked everything to protect them, and though most perished, those few who lived carried the memory for the world. Today, memorials to children stand at Auschwitz, Ravensbrück, and countless sites of massacre, reminding visitors of what was stolen. Tiny shoes, dolls, and photographs sit behind glass, silent yet eloquent testimonies of loss. These artifacts confront us with the enormity of the crime and the fragility of human life. To remember the children is to acknowledge the deepest wound of the camps. They remind us why memory must never fade. Their absence speaks louder than any words. By late 1944, as the Red Army advanced from the east and Allied forces pressed from the west, the SS initiated mass evacuations of the camps. The goal was not only to prevent prisoners from falling into enemy hands, but also to continue exploiting their labor until the very end. Tens of thousands of women were forced from barracks with little warning, herded into columns stretching for miles. Guards barked orders as women stumbled onto frozen roads, clothed in rags and carrying whatever scraps they possessed. These were not orderly transfers, but desperate, chaotic movements, driven by fear of encirclement. The SS hoped to conceal evidence of atrocities by scattering prisoners across the Reich. Many women believed liberation was near, yet instead they were thrust into new ordeals of hunger and exhaustion. Each march was both a retreat and a continuation of brutality. Death itself became the constant companion of every step. The conditions on the marches were beyond human endurance. Women walked through snow and ice without shoes, their feet swelling and bleeding until every step was agony. Food rations were non-existent or deliberately withheld, forcing prisoners to gnaw at grass, bark, or scraps found along the road. Those who collapsed were beaten, shot, or left to freeze where they fell, their bodies lining the ditches like silent markers of suffering. Marches often lasted for weeks, covering distances of hundreds of kilometers through ruined towns and countryside. Civilians sometimes glimpsed the processions torn between pity, fear, and indifference. The marches became rivers of human misery winding through a collapsing Reich. Guards drove prisoners forward with whips, rifle butts, and dogs. For many women, it was not liberation that came first, but death upon the road. The snow itself became their final shroud. Evacuations from Ravensbrück, Auschwitz, and smaller subcamps poured women onto the roads of Central Europe. From January 1945 alone, more than 50,000 women and children were forced into marches from Auschwitz westward. Entire columns stretched beyond sight, each prisoner chained to the fate of the one beside her. Survivors remembered the eerie silence broken only by coughs, moans, and the bark of guards. The retreating Reich turned its roads into highways of despair, lined with emaciated figures stumbling forward. Women clutched each other for support, leaning on shoulders when legs refused to move. Snow and mud swallowed shoes, leaving bare feet to cut on stones and ice. Some attempted escape, but most were too weak, and reprisals were swift and lethal. Each kilometer consumed lives, reducing columns by the dozens. The marches themselves became open-air exterminations. The psychological strain was unbearable, as hope alternated with despair. Prisoners did not know where they were being taken, or whether survival was even possible. Rumors spread that they were marching toward execution sites, while others whispered of possible exchanges or liberation. The uncertainty was as crippling as hunger, gnawing at the mind with every step. Guards instilled terror deliberately, mocking the prisoners and boasting of their fate. At night, women huddled in barns, fields, or open roads, their bodies pressed together for warmth. Frostbite gnawed at hands and feet, leaving lasting scars for those who endured. Diseases spread quickly, for there was no medical care, only indifference to suffering. Yet even in this darkness, acts of humanity flickered. Women shared scraps of cloth, morsels of food, and whispered words of courage. Endurance became resistance against despair. The marches exposed the complicity and reactions of civilians in occupied territories. Some villagers quietly offered bread or water, slipping sustenance into trembling hands despite the risk of reprisal. Others turned away, unwilling or afraid to acknowledge the human tragedy passing their doors. In some cases, civilians alerted guards to women attempting escape, sealing their deaths. The sight of skeletal women trudging through towns seared memories into witnesses that would haunt them long after the war. Columns passed through landscapes already shattered by bombings and retreating armies, intensifying the sense of apocalypse. The contrast between ordinary life and extraordinary suffering played out in stark relief. Horses pulled carts for farmers, while starving women stumbled only a few meters away. The civilian world brushed against the camps, yet remained separated by silence and fear. These fleeting encounters revealed both compassion and betrayal. Each choice etched itself into history. The death marches also revealed the desperation of the Nazi regime. With railways destroyed and front lines collapsing, the SS turned to forced marches as both transportation and extermination. They sought to prevent testimony of their crimes from reaching the Allies, yet their actions left endless witnesses. In their cruelty, they attempted to prolong a system already in ruins. For the prisoners, this meant enduring suffering until the very last weeks of the war. Columns often reached new camps, already overwhelmed with refugees, spreading disease and starvation further. Women were crammed into overcrowded barracks or left exposed in open fields. Guards themselves grew restless and disorganized, torn between orders and their own survival. The chaos of the marches mirrored the chaos of the Reich itself, yet through this collapse, the machinery of brutality kept turning. Even in defeat, cruelty persisted. Individual testimonies of survivors offer chilling glimpses into the marches. Women recalled collapsing into ditches only to feel rifles pressed against their backs. Others remembered clinging to friends, pulling them forward until one stumbled for the last time. Mothers carried children in their arms until their own bodies failed, choosing death together rather than separation. Some women described the haunting sight of frozen corpses left unburied, their faces still visible beneath snow. The constant sound of boots on frozen ground became a rhythm of despair. Hunger gnawed at every thought, turning survival into a minute-by-minute calculation. Yet amidst this, women also spoke of small miracles, a stolen potato, a kind gesture, a whispered prayer. These fragments of humanity gave strength where none should have existed. Memory itself became their resistance. By spring 1945, the death marches had claimed tens of thousands of lives. Estimates suggest that over a quarter of those forced on these evacuations never reached their destinations. For women prisoners, liberation often came not through gates, but on the very roads of death, as advancing Allied troops stumbled upon columns. Survivors collapsed in disbelief, too weak to grasp freedom after so much suffering. Liberation was both salvation and agony, for it came too late for countless companions. The marches stand as one of the final atrocities of the Nazi system, extending cruelty to its last breath. They demonstrated the regime's refusal to surrender its grip, even in collapse. For women who endured, every step carried ghosts of those who fell. Their survival became a testament etched into history. The death marches remain the last, harrowing chapter of captivity. In the spring of 1945, the gates of hell finally opened as Allied forces advanced into the heart of Germany and occupied territories. The Soviets approached from the east, storming through Poland, while the Americans and British pushed from the west. For women imprisoned in camps like Ravensbrück, Auschwitz, and Bergen-Belsen, liberation came suddenly, often without warning. One morning, guards might vanish. The next, foreign soldiers appeared, bringing with them both salvation and disbelief. Women stumbled from barracks, skeletal and sick, blinking into the light as if seeing the world for the first time. Some fell to their knees in prayer, others clutched strangers in sobs of relief. Yet liberation was not a single moment of joy, but a confusing flood of emotions. Years of hunger, fear, and humiliation did not vanish instantly. Freedom arrived wrapped in exhaustion, grief, and overwhelming uncertainty. Survival was only the beginning of a new struggle. At Auschwitz, liberation came with the Red Army's arrival on January 27, 1945. Soldiers found more than 7,000 prisoners left behind, too weak to march on the roads of death. Women lay on straw, barely breathing, surrounded by corpses that had not yet been buried. Children clung to mothers who no longer had the strength to rise. The Soviets entered silently, stunned by the enormity of what they saw. Soldiers accustomed to war were shaken to tears by the sight of emaciated women and children, reduced to shadows. Survivors recalled how the Russians shared their bread, offering food carefully so as not to overwhelm fragile bodies. Liberation was both salvation and shock, for many prisoners could not grasp that the nightmare was over. Some whispered, "Is this real?" while others could only weep in silence. The barbed wire that had caged them now stood as a broken monument to survival. In the West, American troops liberated camps such as Dachau and Buchenwald, uncovering the suffering of women held in subcamps nearby. The liberators were greeted with hollow stares, eyes too sunken to show joy, but too alive to hide gratitude. Women stumbled toward the soldiers, reaching out with trembling hands. The Americans, hardened by years of combat, were stunned into silence at the sight before them. They shared rations, but medics quickly warned that even kindness could kill, as starved bodies could not handle sudden abundance. Liberation therefore required careful coordination, balancing compassion with medical urgency. At Dachau, women spoke their first words of freedom through whispered names, trying to find missing relatives among the chaos. Soldiers wrote down testimonies, realizing they were the first witnesses to atrocities that defied comprehension. Liberation was both revelation and responsibility. The burden of memory had begun. The British liberation of Bergen-Belsen on April 15, 1945, became one of the most harrowing scenes of the war. Women emerged from barracks filled with typhus, dysentery, and corpses stacked like firewood. Survivors described the stench as unbearable, a smell that clung to the uniforms of liberators for weeks. British troops, unprepared for what they encountered, immediately summoned medical units and relief teams. Nurses and doctors struggled to triage thousands of skeletal survivors, many on the brink of death. Some women, after enduring years of torment, died within hours of freedom, their bodies too frail to recover. Others clung stubbornly to life, determined to see another sunrise at last. The liberation was filmed and photographed, shocking the world with undeniable images of Nazi cruelty. For women in Bergen-Belsen, freedom arrived in the shadow of death. Liberation and mourning were inseparable. The shock of freedom manifested differently for every woman. Some could not stop walking, pacing beyond the gates, as if afraid the barbed wire might close again. Others curled up on the ground, unwilling to leave the familiar misery of the barracks. Many wept uncontrollably, their emotions breaking through after years of forced silence. The simplest gestures, drinking clean water, washing in soap, lying on white sheets, felt almost unreal. Nurses recalled how women sometimes asked if they were dreaming, afraid they would wake back in the camp. Liberation was therefore not an instant transformation, but a gradual awakening to humanity. It required time to rebuild the idea of self, the memory of dignity, and the trust in safety. The end of captivity was both freedom and bewilderment. The women stood on the threshold of life, unsure how to step forward. Testimonies gathered in those first days revealed the depths of the camp's horrors. Survivors told soldiers of mass killings, of selections, of experiments conducted on their bodies. Women whispered about children torn away, about friends beaten to death, about nights filled with terror. The liberators listened in stunned silence, struggling to absorb the enormity of what they heard. Many soldiers later admitted that these stories haunted them more than battlefields ever had. The women, for their part, spoke with urgency, knowing their words carried the weight of the dead. Testimony became the first act of remembrance, a bridge from silence to history. Relief workers wrote feverishly, collecting fragments of truth before they were lost to trauma. The liberation of women was not only a physical release, but a demand to bear witness. Their voices became the first monuments. Relief efforts began immediately, but faced immense challenges. Camps were overrun with disease, malnutrition, and psychological trauma. Doctors struggled to treat thousands at once, with resources stretched thin across the collapsing front lines. Women were given clean clothes, food, and medical care, yet many remained haunted by nightmares that medicine could not heal. Repatriation became another ordeal, as survivors often discovered that families were gone and homes destroyed. For Jewish women, liberation sometimes meant realizing they were the sole survivors of entire communities. Aid organizations like the Red Cross worked tirelessly, but recovery required more than rations and beds. It required rebuilding identity, dignity, and hope from ashes. Liberation was therefore both a beginning and a void. Freedom had to be learned again. For women who survived, liberation was the moment their suffering entered history, yet also the moment their lives became defined by absence. They carried the weight of those who did not live to see freedom. Their testimonies became sacred evidence, ensuring the world could never deny the cruelty they endured. In that sense, liberation was not just an end but a responsibility passed to survivors. The first days of freedom were filled with confusion, relief, and unimaginable grief. Yet they also revealed resilience, as women began to reclaim voices stolen by silence. Some would go on to testify in trials, others to write memoirs, and many to build new lives from ruins. Liberation was the beginning of memory as resistance. The women who endured became living witnesses for the dead. Their freedom was the world's final warning. When the war ended in 1945, the world turned from battlefields to courtrooms, seeking justice for crimes that defied imagination. The Nuremberg trials became the centerpiece of international law, but many crimes against women unfolded in quieter hearings across Europe. Special attention was given to camps like Ravensbrück and Auschwitz, where female prisoners had endured unique forms of suffering. The Allies recognized that the testimony of survivors, often women, was essential to understanding the full scope of atrocities. Courtrooms became theaters of memory, where voices once silenced spoke with clarity and pain. The accused sat in the dock, their power stripped, confronted by the people they once tormented. Photographs, documents, and camp records were presented as irrefutable proof of systemic cruelty. Yet more powerful than any paper were the voices of survivors themselves. Their testimonies turned abstraction into lived truth. Justice began with the courage to speak. At Ravensbrück, a series of British military tribunals took place between 1946 and 1948. Female SS guards, once feared in the camp, now faced charges of murder, brutality, and crimes against humanity. Survivors described how women like Dorothea Binns and Ruth Closius Nudek had beaten prisoners with whips and sticks, sometimes to death. The infamous Irma Grace, already convicted at Belsen, epitomized the cruelty of young women empowered by ideology and sadism. In court, their demeanor shocked observers. Some remained defiant, others indifferent, and a few claimed they had only followed orders. Witnesses detailed the bone graft experiments, forced sterilizations, and daily punishments that had defined Ravensbrück. The sheer volume of testimonies revealed a world built on humiliation and suffering. The trials were broadcast in newspapers, sending ripples through a Europe desperate for accountability. Sentences ranged from execution to imprisonment, though many perpetrators escaped justice. Ravensbrück's legacy lived in the words of those who testified. The Auschwitz trials, held in Krakow in 1947, brought more than 40 defendants before Polish judges. Among them were both male and female camp staff, including doctors and SS guards. Survivors gave harrowing accounts of selections on the ramps, where children, the elderly, and the sick were sent directly to gas chambers. Women spoke of the orchestra playing as columns march toward death, of babies torn from mothers, and of experiments disguised as medicine. Former prisoners stood face to face with figures who had once decided life or death with a gesture. For many, the act of testifying was as much about remembrance as retribution. The courtroom became a mirror, reflecting the machinery of annihilation back onto those who had wielded it. Some defendants were sentenced to death, others to prison, yet countless perpetrators had already fled or hidden. Auschwitz's trials revealed both the possibility and limits of justice. They ensured the world could never claim ignorance. One striking feature of post-war justice was the prominence of female SS guards in the dock. Unlike the image of war as a male domain, these women had been enforcers of cruelty in barracks and camps. Names like Ilse Koch, the Witch of Buchenwald, became synonymous with sadism and excess. Koch was accused of selecting prisoners for beatings and of grotesque trophies made from human skin. Though evidence on some charges was disputed, her trial captured headlines and public outrage. At Ravensbrück, Irma Grayes was remembered for her whip and her cold indifference toward suffering. The trials forced societies to confront the unsettling reality that women could also embody violence and oppression. Survivors testified that cruelty had no gender, only ideology. Justice demanded recognition of all perpetrators, regardless of sex. These trials broadened the world's understanding of complicity. Survivor testimonies in these trials carried immense weight, though giving them was an act of courage. Many women stepped into courtrooms still frail from starvation, carrying scars both physical and invisible. They described roll calls in freezing snow, nights filled with screams, and the faces of guards who haunted their memories. Their words were often calm, but their impact was devastating, shaking observers to silence. Judges listened as women recounted the theft of children, the degradation of bodies, and the loss of dignity. Each testimony transformed statistics into human stories, impossible to dismiss. Yet reliving the trauma was also a burden, reopening wounds that never fully healed. Survivors spoke not only for themselves but for the countless voices silenced forever. In doing so, they preserved memory as evidence. Their courage became the cornerstone of historical truth. Yet justice was incomplete, as many perpetrators slipped through the cracks. The chaos of post-war Europe allowed countless camp guards and administrators to vanish into civilian life. Some blended back into communities, changing names or escaping to other countries. Female guards in particular were often underestimated, their crimes dismissed as secondary to those of men. Many survivors later expressed frustration that the scale of punishment did not match the scale of suffering. Trials were selective, limited by political priorities and legal frameworks. The emerging Cold War shifted focus as new enemies took precedence over past crimes. Accountability was uneven, leaving survivors with both relief and disappointment. Justice was partial, fragile, and often unsatisfying. The shadow of impunity lingered long after the verdicts. Nevertheless, the trials established precedents that shaped international law. Crimes against women were recognized not merely as byproducts of war, but as deliberate strategies of terror. Forced labor, medical experiments, and sexual violence became part of the legal record, acknowledged for their systemic nature. The courage of female survivors ensured that gendered experiences were not erased from history. Their testimonies expanded the definition of war crimes, laying groundwork for future prosecutions of atrocities. Though sentences varied, the moral weight of these trials was undeniable. They demonstrated that the world could no longer look away from crimes committed behind barbed wire. In that sense, justice transcended verdicts. It became a promise of remembrance. The words spoken in cramped courtrooms resonated far beyond their walls. They entered the collective conscience of humanity. For many survivors, the trials were both closure and reminder of wounds that could never heal. Watching their tormentors condemned offered a measure of vindication, yet it could not restore families' health or lost childhoods. Justice in courtrooms was necessarily limited, constrained by laws and politics, but the act of speaking, of bearing witness, carried a deeper legacy than any sentence. It ensured that the crimes of Ravensbrück, Auschwitz, and countless other camps would never be forgotten. The presence of women, both as victims and as perpetrators, etched complexity into the narrative of justice. The trials revealed humanity's capacity for cruelty and its demand for accountability. Though imperfect, they marked a beginning rather than an end. The legacy of these proceedings lies in memory, testimony, and the unending pursuit of truth. Justice, however incomplete, became part of survival. When the war ended, silence often fell heavier than liberation for many women who had survived the camps. The world was eager to rebuild, and survivors found little space to recount horrors that few wanted to hear. Many carried trauma so deep that words seemed inadequate to describe what they had endured. Others feared disbelief, ashamed of experiences that society often stigmatized, such as sexual violence and forced labor. For years their stories lingered in private diaries, whispered conversations, or memories locked away in silence. Some women wrote in secret, pouring pain onto pages never meant for others' eyes. Yet those diaries, fragile and personal, became treasures of history when discovered later. They captured emotions as raw as the moments in which they were written. In their silence, survivors bore witness to absence as much as presence. Their unspoken stories haunted the decades that followed. The first memoirs emerged hesitantly in the late 1940s, often met with indifference or disbelief. Survivors like Charlotte Delbo, who chronicled her time in Auschwitz, struggled to find publishers willing to take on such dark material. Many accounts were relegated to small presses or circulated privately, far from the wider public eye. In the immediate aftermath of war, nations preferred narratives of heroism over those of suffering. Women survivors, in particular, faced additional barriers as their experiences were seen as secondary to those of men at the front lines. Yet within these pages lay testimonies of starvation, separation, and the quiet heroism of endurance. These early voices spoke not only for themselves, but for millions who could not. Though their works were initially overlooked, they planted seeds for remembrance. In time, they became foundational texts for Holocaust studies. What began in whispers would grow into an unshakable chorus. The weight of silence was often tied to unbearable memories of family. Women who had lost children, parents, or siblings found it almost impossible to recount their fates. To speak aloud was to relive the moment of separation at the ramp, the sound of cries that never ceased echoing. Many chose silence to protect their own children born after the war, shielding them from knowledge too heavy to bear. Others remained quiet because society refused to believe that mothers had been forced to watch their infants murdered. The burden of testimony was not only personal but collective, colliding with disbelief and denial. For decades, women survivors carried history privately, their silence an act of survival in itself. Yet silence was also a prison, one that locked trauma within fragile hearts. The eventual decision to speak was often as painful as the memories themselves. Testimony became both release and reopening of wounds. By the 1960s and 1970s, a new wave of survivor voices began to emerge. Social changes and the growing awareness of Holocaust denial created urgency for testimony. Women who had been silent for decades began to record their memories before time erased them. Oral history projects gathered testimonies in living rooms and community halls, capturing voices trembling with both pain and defiance. Memoirs like those of Sarah Nomberg-Presitic and Germaine Tillian provided searing detail about camp life. Their words carried the texture of reality, the cold of barracks, the hunger of endless days, the terror of selections. Testimonies became bridges between the past and the present, carrying lived experience to generations who had not seen war. The world slowly began to listen, recognizing the depth of truth contained in women's voices. Memory moved from private spaces to public consciousness. Silence gave way to fragile but necessary speech. For many survivors, testimony was not a single event, but a lifelong process. Each retelling brought back images they had tried to bury, forcing them to navigate pain with every word. Some women broke down during interviews, unable to continue, while others spoke with calm precision, determined to be heard. They testified in classrooms, community centers, and later at war crimes tribunals, lending their words to history itself. Their stories expanded the narrative of the Holocaust, ensuring that the suffering of women and children was not overlooked. Testimony also created connections across borders, as survivors found strength in hearing each other's accounts. Together they transformed isolated trauma into collective memory. The act of speaking was itself an act of defiance against those who had sought to erase them. Through testimony, women reclaimed agency stolen in the camps. Their words became living monuments. The importance of diaries and memoirs cannot be overstated. Written accounts captured details that might otherwise have been forgotten, names of fellow prisoners, dates of selections, or the small acts of kindness that made survival possible. These documents also preserved the emotional texture of life inside the camps. They revealed not only hunger and brutality, but also moments of hope, humor, and love. Diaries written in secret, often hidden under mattresses or smuggled out of camps, became irreplaceable artifacts of history. When published after the war, they challenged audiences to confront truths many preferred to ignore. They also provided historians with first-hand sources, grounding academic studies in lived experience. Women's words reshaped how history remembered the camps, emphasizing the intersection of survival, motherhood, and gendered suffering. In ink and memory, they defied annihilation. The written word became a weapon against forgetting. The late 20th century brought renewed urgency as survivors aged, and their voices became more precious than ever. Filmmakers, scholars, and educators worked to preserve testimonies through audio and video recordings. Projects like the USC Shoah Foundation collected thousands of hours of survivor accounts, many from women who had never spoken publicly before. These recordings captured gestures, pauses, and silences as meaningful as words themselves. They revealed how memory is carried not just in facts, but in the trembling of a hand or the breaking of a voice. Women survivors often describe speaking as a responsibility to the dead, a moral duty to ensure truth outlived them. Their testimonies educated new generations who would never meet a survivor in person. In this way, their words bridged time, connecting past to future. The act of remembering became a legacy, passed down. Testimony transformed into inheritance. The voices of survivors stand as the most powerful antidote to denial and forgetting. They transformed silence into history, trauma into truth, and memory into resistance. Women's testimonies, once marginalized, now occupy central space in the story of the Holocaust. Their diaries, memoirs, and interviews ensure that the suffering of mothers, daughters, and sisters is never erased from collective memory. Each word, written or spoken, is a monument to survival and defiance. Their voices remind the world that history is not only numbers, but faces, names, and human experiences. They teach that memory itself is an act of justice, carried across generations. For women survivors, speaking became the ultimate victory over a system built to silence them. Their testimonies are not just history, they are warnings, lessons, and calls to humanity. In their voices, the past still breathes. In the decades after the war, the memory of women in the camps was fragile, suspended between silence and remembrance. Many survivors carried their pain privately, speaking little, while societies eager to rebuild often preferred silence over confrontation. Yet gradually, their experiences began to emerge, shaping how the Holocaust was remembered across generations. Museums and memorials rose on the very soil where they had suffered, turning sites of death into landscapes of education. At Auschwitz, Ravensbrück, and Bergen-Belsen, visitors walk through barracks that still echo with the voices of women who once lived there. Stones, plaques, and exhibits preserve fragments of lives nearly erased. Memory became a form of justice, preserving stories that tribunals could not fully honor. Each memorial carried the weight of testimony transformed into public history. Silence gave way to remembrance, but only after decades of struggle. The legacy of women survivors was finally finding its voice. Museums became crucial custodians of women's experiences, presenting personal artifacts that defy abstraction. A child's shoe, a strand of hair, or a prisoner's dress conveys truths that no statistic can capture. At Yad Vashem, the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, and European institutions, women's stories hold central place in exhibitions. Diaries written in cramped handwriting sit alongside photographs of mothers and daughters, bridging the gap between past and present. These spaces invite visitors not only to learn, but to feel, transforming history into lived experience. Survivors themselves guided early tours, walking younger generations through barracks and crematoria. Their voices imbued these institutions with authenticity, turning walls into classrooms of memory. Museums ensured that women's suffering was not overlooked but woven into the larger fabric of Holocaust history. The personal became universal, and remembrance became duty. Each display whispers, "This was real, and it must never return." Memorials on former campsites serve as both graveyards and sanctuaries of reflection. At Ravensbrück, sculptures of women stand in silent defiance, embodying resilience amid despair. In Auschwitz-Birkenau, endless rows of shoes and suitcases testify to lives cut short. These memorials invite not only mourning, but confrontation with humanity's capacity for cruelty. Visitors walk through ruins of barracks, touching the cold brick and sensing history beneath their hands. The silence of these sites is deafening, broken only by the whispers of guides and the footsteps of school groups. Women's suffering is etched into the landscapes themselves, preserved in stone and memory. Each site is both local and global, reminding nations of their complicity and humanity's responsibility. The act of visiting becomes a pilgrimage, a step toward ensuring memory survives. The ground itself speaks, carrying echoes of lives lost and voices reclaimed. Education emerged as one of the most powerful legacies of women's experiences in the camps. Survivors spent their later years entering classrooms, speaking to children, and ensuring their stories outlived them. They described hunger, cold, and loss, but also moments of solidarity that made survival possible. Teachers integrated these narratives into history lessons, weaving personal testimony into broader understanding of the Holocaust. Educational programs stressed the unique vulnerability of women and children, expanding historical awareness beyond military campaigns. Films and documentaries carried these stories across the globe, reaching audiences who might never visit memorial sites. Survivors' words became lessons in humanity, not just history. By sharing their suffering, they hoped to build empathy and prevent repetition. Education turned memory into action, shaping how societies teach responsibility. Through classrooms, the voices of women continued to speak long after their passing. The silence of earlier decades has itself become part of the legacy. Historians now recognize that many women survivors needed years, even lifetimes, to find words for their trauma. This delay reflected both personal pain and societal reluctance to listen. When they finally spoke, their voices carried the weight of decades of silence. That silence is a reminder of how trauma resists articulation, how wounds linger long after liberation. It also underscores the courage required to transform memory into testimony. The act of breaking silence became as significant as the words themselves. It turned personal suffering into collective history, ensuring that absence did not erase presence. Today, silence is studied alongside speech, both essential to understanding survival. Memory includes both what was said and what could not be spoken. For future generations, women's stories offer more than historical fact. They embody lessons in resilience, compassion, and vigilance. They remind us that even in the darkest conditions, acts of kindness and solidarity endured. Women shared bread, protected children, and whispered songs as resistance against dehumanization. Their legacy teaches that survival was not only physical but moral, sustained by human connection. Future generations inherit these lessons through books, films, and family testimonies. Children of survivors, often called the second generation, carry the responsibility of remembrance forward. Their voices too ensure continuity, bridging lived memory with inherited memory. In classrooms and memorials, young people are reminded that history is not distant but urgent. Women's experiences in the camps reveal the stakes of indifference and the power of empathy. Their stories are gifts, warnings, and responsibilities intertwined. Art and literature have also preserved the legacy of women in the camps. Writers like Charlotte Delbo and poets like Gertrude Colmar translated trauma into art, transforming memory into language of beauty and pain. Their works captured what testimony alone could not: the emotional landscapes of despair and hope. Paintings, sculptures, and performances by survivors and descendants continue to honor women's resilience. These artistic legacies expand the reach of memory, making history resonate beyond textbooks. They invite audiences to feel rather than simply to know. Through art, silence becomes sound, absence becomes presence, and loss becomes collective mourning. Women's experiences inspire creativity that resists forgetting. Their suffering becomes fuel for cultural remembrance. Art ensures memory is not static but alive, reshaped in every generation. The legacy of women in the camps is both fragile and enduring, carried in stories, memorials, and the lives of those who survived. Their voices, once silenced by barbed wire and fear, now shape global memory of the Holocaust. Museums, classrooms, and books ensure that their testimonies remain part of humanity's conscience. Yet memory requires constant renewal, for denial and indifference threaten to erode what has been preserved. The responsibility now falls to future generations to protect and transmit these histories. Women's experiences remind us that the Holocaust was not only a story of armies, but of families, of mothers, daughters, and sisters caught in its path. Their suffering, survival, and silence all form part of the record. Remembering them is not only an act of history, but of humanity. In their legacy, the past continues to speak. In their memory, the world finds warning and hope.